is this? I don't know. It's me. It's Amid the Ruins. It's a guy who makes Dyer wave music. It's Amid the Ruins. Dyer wave music.
What I've talked about in, probably 100 articles of Jay's analysis is the implementation of the AI smart grid and the giant smart cities, which is what IBM talks about publicly building. And that's where we're going, and that's what I think we have to be really concerned about. So all of these tensions, they are part of a long-term strategy to basically get everybody moved into mega cities. They'll be forced off of land and so forth for environmental reasons, and basically concocted and invented environmental nonsense. Then you'll be stuck in some hellhole mega city in a, basically a carton-sized apartment living over a Target or something, or inside of a Target or a Walmart, as I said several years ago. It's actually coming true now. There's actually Target cities. This is all part of the long-term globalist strategy. So, but to get there, you've got to have the constant clash, the constant alchemical blending and mixing and smashing together right out of Manichaeanism to produce the convergence, to produce the synthesis. And that's what's crucial in all this, and what is absolutely true from an alchemical, esoteric, philosophical, and geopolitical perspective, the fact the ruling elite seek to be post-human. jaysanalysis.com. fix today's problems politically. And this is what so many people in alt circles and alt-right and alt-whatever and alt-media, they all seem to think that there's like a political solution to man's problems. And really the whole of modernity is built on this neo-pagan concept of political salvation. And there is no political salvation for man, because man's problems are not essentially political, they're spiritual. The hierarchy of how man views himself in the world has been inverted. I've covered over and over and over the white papers that actually discussed how to invert and subvert that, changing images of man, things like this. So what has to happen is that the inversion has to be reverted back to the way it needs to be. And that means that first and foremost for man, it is spiritual issues. Those come first. Then we have the things like the philosophy and the family and the social issues and things like that. That comes next. And race or ethnicity can be classed as part of that. That is, in other words, you caring for your people is just a broader extension of the family, the tribe, the nation. Right? It all depends on what we mean by these words and these terms. Now, America and Americanism is the first attempt at a completely propositional nation. And this is well known. This is not debated in political theory. I think even Abraham Lincoln referred to it that way. J. Dyer of J's Analysis. All right, what's up, nerds? Welcome. It's a beautiful Sunday day, and we are going to be covering a topic that I think would be useful to a lot of people. This week we had quite a few questions about the transcendental argument, as we always do, and so I'm always happy to oblige But rather than one-on-one discussions with people that nobody hears and that disappear into the ether, I think it's a lot more useful to try to illustrate via live streams what's the deal. So today, I think it would be nice to cover another debate. Now, we've done a few of these. I covered the Bahnsen and Stein debate. If you didn't see that, go back and watch that video. That's a classic. I covered the Slavoj Zizek, Jordan Peterson debate.
This is the Slavoj Zizek, the way that Jordan Peterson, you are always doing this with your shirt, and if you are sweating pig who snorts the cocaine of my father's soul, will you, Jordan Peterson, say that you do snort the cocaine off of your father's soul and off of your mother's soul's ass?
Right, that's my Slavoj. Forgotten impression everybody loves. I'm going to hold off on all the JBP impressions. We've heard those a million times. And of course, my JBP is far inferior to Made by Jim Bob's. He has the best JBP, as well as I think Greedo in the Discord. Those are the top two. I mean, they're pretty much like perfect final form JBP.
Now, I'm not terrible. You know, when I start going down the road of talking like JBP, you know, it's not terrible. I can do it. I can talk about snorting cocaine off of my father's soul. If that's, you know, what Carl Jung tells me to do in my channeling sessions.
Right, and we can definitely do all that. But today we're going to focus on critiquing the debate. And when we do debate critiques, again, as I said, it's a lot more helpful, I think, in helping people understand what the transcendental argument is and why we make this argument and how it's so powerful. And nuclear strength apologetics, as Bahnsen would call it. And by the way, there was also a critique I did many, many years ago that's still on the channel. You have to dig for it, but I did a critique of William Lane Craig critiquing somebody. So it was a meta level critique where William Lane Craig was basically critiquing an atheist lecture with the standard William Lane Craig apologetic approach, which attempts to kind of blend all apologetics into one. Which I think there's a lot of problems with that approach because, well, we'll get into that. But so this will be good because we're going to see just like with the Zizek Peterson debate, we're going to see the problems and faults on both sides, right? When we listen to Peterson and Zizek debate, we noticed that there were good points and bad points on both sides, and that's because both of them were essentially coming out of the classical liberal dialectic, both of them presenting different forms of liberalism. The other reason we're going to do this debate is because it's similar in ways to the debate that I had with Matt Dillahunty. And if you know that debate, then you know the typical three areas that we did the debate review where Matt didn't understand our argument. Three main areas. So that will come up to a degree in this debate. Another point about this debate is that it's very popular. It's had, on one channel just alone, 1 million plus views within a couple of years. And it's had, many, many views on other channels as well. So it's a popular, well-known debate. It will kind of go down, in the history of famous debates as a famous debate, whatever you think of it. But we're going to see the arguments. I mean, it's like there's one point in the middle of the debate that will be the most interesting where Jordan Peterson almost makes a transcendental argument. And then he just kind of backs off of it, which I don't know why. Maybe he doesn't really understand what the transcendental argument is. Now, I'm pretty sure, I'm about 90 to 95% sure that about 4 or 5 years ago, he read some of my essays about numbers prove God and transcendental arguments, because I noticed some of his old tweets back in the day literally were about the arguments I was making in that paper. Now, I don't know for sure, but of course, Tristan has interviewed Michaela multiple times, and Jonathan Pajot, of course, has interviewed Jordan Peterson many times. So, I've interacted with Pajot for many years, and so it's entirely possible that there was some cross-pollination there. I'm not saying that Jonathan, was necessarily sharing my articles with Jordan or anything like that, but it's possible, is all I'm saying, that he had seen some of the arguments, and he does at times kind of verge on a transcendental argument. So that's the high point of the debate, when he does kind of call out Matt Dillahunty on that, and I will give some credit there. That was a good point there in the middle, but kind of wish he'd taken it a little bit further. And by the way, I would give a shout out to Jonathan Pajot, because Matt Fradd, of course, who would not have a conversation with any of us, which is fine. I'm not butthurt about that. I don't really care about whether Matt Fradd will talk to me. I'm more concerned about the fact that he wanted to get into people who could defend the Orthodox position, and he refused to do it with Ubi. Right? I was actually more interested in seeing Ubi go on there and debate Matt. And so Matt, I guess, wants to delve into the realm of debate now. Instead of just being an interviewer, he wants to discuss. And so he had a discussion with Jonathan Pajot, and credit to Jonathan for really defending the Orthodox conception of iconography and pointing out how the Roman Catholic approach, especially Renaissance and on, moves into paganism and the importation of things that were forbidden by the Seventh Council. And so I'm glad that Pajot called that out, and he was correct to do so. That was a good point. Anyway, you can go check that out. But today we're going to talk about this debate, and we'll kind of do it the way we did the Bahnsen-Stein debate about a year ago. So that was 1 year ago, almost today, maybe. It was right around this time last year when I just moved in, and this library wasn't even set up yet, but we were critiquing the Bahnsen-Stein debate and helping people to understand the argument. So let's try that again today, and let's kick it off. The other thing, too, is that this argument I think from a pragmatic standpoint, I understand what Jordan was doing by invoking for about the first 30 minutes psychedelics. It's just that that's not a good argument. I mean, it's a pragmatic appeal to utility, I guess you could say, is where he's going with it, because he makes that point at one point in the debate. As you'll see, he'll say that atheists have confused the fact that we don't make scientific style arguments for Christianity because religion is a meaning generator that gives life meaning. And so it's not going to do what science tries to do. The problem is that while that's partly true, it still is reducing religion to a utilitarian function. And the thing that Matt will kind of correctly hone in on is that the Bible, or Christianity, for example, in particular, that's what we're going to be focusing on here, does not relegate the religion that it promotes, that it claims to believe, and particularly about the person of Christ, to the domain of utilitarian pragmatic function. You see what I mean? And so if it doesn't consistently, right, back up its claims, then it's not worthy of belief. Because really you could squeeze any paradigm or worldview into a utilitarian framework, right? Oh, well, we do this because it works. Remember the show that we did a couple shows back with Tristan where we analyzed Bertrand Russell. Remember Bertrand Russell was talking about why he was an atheist, and the interviewer woman said, well, why do you have to reduce it to proofs and logic? Why can't you just admit that religion has a positive influence in people's lives? I mean, again, these are terrible arguments. And this is, I think, what Jordan's trying to do with the appeal to psychedelics, which is to claim that it has helped people. And so that could suggest something more than materialism. But Matt is correct to point out that it doesn't prove anything. I mean, it doesn't. It's just totally inconclusive. So let's put this little picture up here. You could see me with Premiere soy face there. And I'm not going to play the actual video because I'm always nervous about people trying to strike it. So we're going to be listening to the audio here, like last time. And then we got what's up? We got 500 nerds off the cuff here. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here. If you would hit like and share. And let's get into this debate, and we're going to see how well these arguments hold up. You know, are these solid arguments? Who's got the better argument? And how would I have presented my argument? And by the way, linked in the show description is the Jordan Peterson, Matt Dillahunty debate, my debate with Matt Dillahunty, and some other links as well as, you know, the Zizek stuff. So let's get into the beginning of this debate, and I will be pausing and commenting, as you can imagine. This stupid thing's going to shut down right in the middle of it.
Battery 90%. Connected to iPhone.
Thank you. What's up, babe? How you doing? Got robot girl sitting on me. Connected to iPhone. All right.
All right.
And we're going to skip Matt's comedy intro, so-called there.
Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Hopefully this sounds good. It's your Bose, baby. The Bose speaker.
They're going nuts.
The reason I have to do it on this stupid ghetto rig up here is because if you do it through Streamlabs OBS, you can't pause stuff. Like if you're playing a video, it doesn't let you pause it. By the way, we got the whiteboard, baby. Maybe we have to break out that whiteboard. We'll see.
They were so loud, I was almost knocked over into my chair. How are you?
I'm good, Matt. Thank you.
All right.
Ha 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 ha.
Well, there were people who came and were like, "Oh, this was said and this was said."
All right, come on, Matt. We're gonna skip all this stuff. Let's get to the meat.
Perspective or a metaphoric perspective.
I can't find the actual place it starts. Here we go. There we go. This is it. What is going on?
Well, it's a complicated problem, and I don't think that we take it with due seriousness. I specifically don't think that the celebrity atheist types, who I actually have a fair bit of respect for, by the way, take it with due seriousness.
So this is the beginning of the debate, and it's just the opening statement by Peterson. It's more of a conversational format, by the way, where Peterson says, the problem of God is a complex problem. The new atheists don't take it very seriously. Which, okay, yeah, that's true.
So I don't think that they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective or a phenomenological perspective or a literary perspective or a metaphoric perspective. That'll do for starters. I've become convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very
What was that?
functional cultures, Western cultures say,
Somebody's been
are
listening to today's analysis over the years.
immovably in a metaphorical substrate, and that when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you're in the domain of religious phenomenology.
Now here's where Jordan gets a little muddled, because the whole of his approach is psychological / mythological narrative, right? Which that's not wrong in the sense of, like, you can have that angle or that look at life. The problem is that both of these figures, as with all Enlightenment figures, reduce their story to the only way to look at reality. For Matt, it's skepticism, materialism, empiricism. For Jordan, it's mythological storytelling and maps of meaning and what he calls a metaphysical substrate. I'm not clear if, and I'm not being mean, but I'm not clear if Jordan knows what a metaphysical substrate is. because archetypes, in a sense, you could say are metaphysical substrates. I mean, in the sense of like the logi, that's what they are. They function in that way. And they do relate to stories, because life is not just abstracted in numbers, it's stories, right? The Bible is a story. And so numbers, logic, these kinds of abstract categories, universals, are just one layer or level of reality. And if you read Losky's book, Dogmatic Theology, there's a chapter on that. It's the chapter on created being, about the aeon. So in a way, yes, I could agree with what Jordan is saying here. It's just that the problem is that when he goes on to make the argument, he tries to divorce his overall argument from any consistent religious system. And that's, I think, the biggest flaw in what Jordan is doing, is trying to have a philosophy, an autonomous philosophy that has pieces right, like, oh, here we'll get a little bit of Carl Jung, a little bit of this, a little bit of this, evolutionary biology, right? Which any of these disciplines or any of these systems will have some truth, right? But the problem is that he will try to do a reductionist move to base his, and I'm not saying that Jordan necessarily believes in strict reductionism. I'm saying that the argument is reducing his maps of meaning, his case, to mythological archetypes. And that's not going to work for an argument. Now, he comes really close, as we'll see in the middle, to a transcendental argument, but it's just not going to take him where he wants it to go. And Matt actually will call that out. So there will be actually Matt will notice this point.
And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion as a consequence of deep philosophical thought and literary analysis, but that if you know enough about brain function, you'll also come to the same conclusion. I think you come to the same conclusion as well if you look at the evolution of religious cognition from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist, and not from the position of a evolutionary biologist whose head is addled by the belief that most of human morality was established in the 500 years since the Enlightenment. So that...
Now, this is an odd move on the part of Jordan, because he stakes his position within the history of the Enlightenment. The rest of his case that he usually makes is couched within classical liberalism. And so he's calling out the approach of the new atheists and the skeptics as kind of more or less being in line with Enlightenment scientism, which is true. But again, I mean, Jordan's position is couched within the exact same framework. Man, I got these new lights in here, and they're like Close Encounters lights. I feel like the aliens are like looking down at me. So anyway, I'm not going to interrupt every 5 seconds, but we'll keep going.
That's a start, I guess.
Except, and so you have to bear with me.
Yeah.
Because I'm from Texas.
That's okay. I'm from Alberta, It's bigger than Texas. Just as bad.
I don't get this bad joke. Is this supposed to imply that, like, if you're from Texas or the South, that you're less sophisticated and the people in the big metro... I mean, really? I'm sorry, but most of the most intelligent people that I know come from the South. They are people who come from Southern families, and that's because they grew up outside of big metropolises and were not propagandized. So, yeah, I'm not sure. But I guess if you're a Reddit tier atheist, then, you're going to gravitate towards, California and New York, because there's this perception of sophistication there, when really in reality it's two regions of different types of propaganda. I mean, literally the dumbest people are in the big cities and in the country. Let me rephrase it like that. It's just different types of propaganda for different types of people. But I just thought this joke was like, it was a dumb joke.
Yeah. So the curious thing for me is all of that applies seemingly, if I'm understanding it, to religious thought, religious tradition, the value of religious identity to individuals. And I don't see that any of it relates to whether or not there is a God or whether or not there's sufficient reason to believe there's a God, which is my sticking point. I'm fully fine with the idea. Oh, yeah. We'll try and get through this without like raucous applause.
There's one
but,
atheist.
Hey, at least I got one.
There's like one atheist in the crowd every time Matt talks. He starts like he's having a coom fit, or like a monkey. Right? The monkeys in the audience who love Matt's monkey arguments.
Yeah, you don't never complain about raucous applause.
Because that's a sticking point for me. I have no problem acknowledging that people derive value
mindlessly clap
from their beliefs, whether or not they map to anything in reality. That they can be inspired and motivated, educated.
Now here's Matt's initial rebuttal, which is correct, right? Where he says that because you lay out this archetypes, this story narrative, I don't know that it maps onto anything in reality. Now, this is the very thing that I called Matt out for in the debate, because Matt's own worldview cannot justify anything mapping onto reality, right? And if he had read The Skeptics, if he had read Bertrand Russell, if he had read David Hume, he would know that his skeptic tradition has consistently repeated that mantra, that we don't actually know that what we use as linguistic descriptors matches up to anything in the external world. Right? That's been a problem since David Hume. And there really is no way to resolve it. And W.V.O. Quine wrote a famous essay saying it's time to give up epistemic justification. It's not possible anymore. And so really all we can do is psychology. So really I think Matt is unaware of his own skeptical tradition and where it went and where the state of modern philosophy is. And he's just not really a skeptic. That's the irony here.
And enlightened by poetry, prose, metaphor, allegory. But my concern is, having grown up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, the people who I know and some of the people who are working to enact.
Remember the point that, as we often say, American Christianity is an atheism factory. So it's not surprising that Matt's journey to atheism is out of something like Southern Baptist.
Legislation on behalf of their beliefs are convinced that they have good reason to believe that there actually is a God, not just that it's useful to them.
Well, it's not that easy to distinguish between what's useful and what's real. So I think that distinction can...
I mean, this is kind of true, but I don't know if Jordan's going in the right direction with this argument. But at times it could be difficult to distinguish, but it depends on what we're talking about. But strictly speaking, no, there's a pretty different category distinction at work here between what's useful, what's utilitarian, and what's real. I mean, that should kind of be a fundamental of like metaphysics and philosophy. I don't know why he thinks this, but it could be. And I don't mean this in a mean, arrogant way, but just from the perspective of studying philosophy, at master's level, is that a lot of people don't know philosophy, obviously. So they don't really know what the vocabulary and the categories and the topics are of philosophy. So maybe that's just the fact that both of these people, and I'm not being mean. I mean, I think in the midst of the debate with Matt, admitted that he's not a trained philosopher. He's more of just kind of a stage performance, storytelling kind of person. And of course, Jordan, I think, has a little more philosophical exposure than Matt, but still, we're not really knowing what we're talking about here in this domain.
It can be made, but it's a lot more difficult than people generally think. And I also think that there's no doubt that there are different levels of sophistication of religious belief. What I see happening in this sort of discussion, say frequently, and again, like I said, I have a fair bit of respect for the atheist types because they spend a lot of time thinking, and that's generally a good thing. I see most of the of their thinking, however, directed at the fundamentalist types, the fundamentalist Christian types, mostly
Yeah.
of the American persuasion,
That's true.
who suffer from the somewhat understandable illusion that the biblical corpus has the same epistemological and ontological status as a scientific theory.
Oh, here we go. Here comes the cringe, right? So we were making good points until we got to this cringe point. Right? The hinge of the cringe right here, where it's true. Remember this move that Stefan and Ben Shapiro would do for many years, where they would only debate like the most idiotic college campus liberals or people, who literally have no philosophical knowledge or training. And it would give the impression, right, the low-hanging fruit thing, right? It would give the impression that, these guys are just intellectual, juggernauts, man. They just BTFO anybody that steps up to the podium. But they would never debate anybody with significant prowess, theological argumentation. It was always idiots, right? But to Stefan's credit, he did. Right? He started having, debates with people with at least some degree of training. Not saying that I'm the expert of all philosophy, but I appreciate that Stefan had that debate with me. So I think he was, looking for finally maybe a better level of conversation about these topics. And I think he did get it. At least the general consensus of the audience in that debate was that it was a very fruitful discussion. But this is a common modus operandi trick where you're not going to see people engaging in a debate that they might lose, right? I mean, this is very rare. And that's one of the problems with debate is that it's like, people keep asking, who are you going to debate next? Who are you going to debate next? Well, we have a hard time finding people to debate. So because big name people typically 9 out of 10 times, they don't want to debate somebody, especially with a smaller audience, because they have nothing to gain, right? So, somebody was asking earlier, when are you going to debate Trent Horn? Well, we already tried to settle that up, right? Trent Horn would only do 30 minutes on his radio show. Well, I'm sorry, you can't debate Divine Simplicity or, Philly Oakway in 30 minutes on his Catholic Answers radio thing. It's just, no. I mean, that's silly, right? Robertson Jenis, let's debate Philly Oakway. Oh, you can't debate that without debating Divine Simplicity, and he didn't want to debate Divine Simplicity. So, this is the problem you run into with trying to set up debates, is this kind of stuff. Anyway, that's just rambling. Let's get back to it.
When it clearly doesn't, right? I mean, if you're
Okay, now we're closer to the same page.
Okay,
Yeah.
if you're a religious thinker, let's say, if you're a serious student of religious thought and a serious philosopher, one of the things you can't claim is that whatever story the Bible is telling is a scientific theory. And that's just self-evident. First of all, like, when was the first scientist? Descartes, Bacon, Newton? Maybe you could chase it back to the Greeks.
This is a bizarre line of argument here. I don't know where Jordan is going with this, except that I think he's trying to find common ground with Matt to say that, hey, I agree with you that the Bible is not going to give you scientifically accurate data. Now, there is I agree with this to an extent, right? The Bible is not presenting things as a scientific thesis. But that doesn't translate to Jordan's conclusion that there's not, quote, accurate scientific style statements in the Bible. Again, it depends on what we're talking about here, because first of all, the Bible is full of a lot of different types of literature, right? There's poetic literature in David's Psalms. Is that going to be scientific? Of course not. There is, prophetic literature in Ezekiel. Is that scientific? No. There is parables. There's allegories, right? There's all of those types. Then there are historical books, right? We read the books of Kings. We read the books of Chronicles. Dang, that's loud, right? And by the way, yes, I will read the super chats from the premiere with Richard, since some of those came in and I wasn't live to read those. So that's true that there are different types of literature, but and we're going to get into this a little bit. There's there's just a red pill you have to swallow if you're going to go in the domain of religion or theology or Christianity, which is that you can't divorce this religion from its history, from its church in history, from its liturgy, and from its kind of ethos. And Jordan will kind of hit on that and talk about ethos, I think, a little bit in this. But that's the problem with his approach, is that, for example, you couldn't say, oh, I want to get into historic Christianity. Maybe it's Roman Catholicism, maybe it's Orthodoxy. I'll take a look at these. But I'm going to keep my assumptions about Genesis. I'm going to keep my assumptions about what I know to be the case in terms of, I don't know, Carl Jung's archetypes, right? And maybe I'll like some of Christianity, but I know that stuff's correct, and I'm going to make my Christianity mesh with that stuff. You can't do that. And the reason you can't do that is because it's a totality worldview that you are looking into. Right? Now, you may not be convinced. Maybe you don't find Christianity ultimately convincing and you go on to do something else. Right? Maybe. But we have to be honest about what the religion is. And that's, again, the problem that we're going to see in this Dillahunty, Jordan, Peterson thing, is that Dillahunty has no grounds for the claims that he makes, right? No justification for what he makes. And he doesn't even know, I'm not trying to be rude, but he doesn't know what it means to talk about epistemic justification. Like, he was totally lost about what that even is in the debate. Jordan, on the other hand, is making some good points and then also falling into the very trap that Dillahunty will correctly call him out for, which is to reduce the religion to something contrary that the religion itself claims about itself, you see. Does historic Christianity say that it has nothing to do with historical claims and facts? Absolutely not. This is a historical religion, right? This is not a religion of you going into a room and meditating to try to get out of your body and go to some other dimension, right? Some sort of, alien rapture. I don't know what, right? Something Hindu yogi or something, right? That's not what this religion is. This is that God came into history. So you cannot divorce Christianity from history. And any attempt to do so makes it into a completely different religion. That's why the genealogies in the book of Luke, right, are so important, because it shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of these messianic prophecies from the Old Testament. We look at the Gospels, for example, and we see Jesus talking about events in the Old Testament. And he talks about Adam and Eve, and he talks about marriage. Does Jesus in the gospel argumentation and apologetic? And yes, if you read the Gospels, you'll notice that Jesus is doing apologetics, right? Does he ever speak as if the events were not historical events? No way, right? He speaks of Adam and Eve as the first people. He speaks of Genesis like it was an accurate telling of what occurred. Now, you may have a hard time with that. A lot of people do. A lot of people say, I just can't believe that. And they think that they're buying into something that is, quote, rational and logical. That's the flip side of that. I just can't believe Genesis. I'm going to believe in Big Bang. I'm going to believe in monkey soup, right? And then you come to find out those are far more fanciful religious positions, right? Under the guise, wearing the cloak of science and scientism, right? That's, of course, a common argument that we make here. But I just want to point that out, that I think Jordan has really shot himself in the foot by beginning his debate approach by saying that I cannot give any kind of scientific or epistemic certitude, and this is another mistake he makes, which is to equate scientific claims with epistemic certitude. No, I'm sorry, if you knew about epistemology, then you would know that those kinds of claims really don't have a whole lot of authority, right, in terms of epistemology and certitude. I mean, empirical sense data claims are pretty low on the hierarchy of certitude, right? If you have good philosophy, I would say. If you want to hear more about that, you can go listen to the talk that I did about universals, abstract objects, numbers, and the critique of Dr. Ed Fazer's book on Aquinas. So I did that talk maybe a month or two ago. But anyway, let's get back to, but we already see pretty significant bad moves on the part of Jordan here.
But no farther than that. And so the idea that whatever the people who conjured up the Old Testament creation account were doing was something akin to scientific theorizing is a mistake that would only be made by people who don't know how to distinguish between different kinds of truth. And so the fundamentalists...
See, here we go again. This is ambiguous. Distinguishing between different types of biblical literature is not the same thing as distinguishing different types of truth. And I don't know what vocabulary sense Jordan means by different senses of truth. I think he's talking about the point that I make often in debates, which is that not every type of thing is known or proven in the same way, right? Bahnsen's cracker in the pantry fallacy. I think that's what he's going for. I don't know if he really understands that, but I think that's what he's kind of shooting for. But he's mistakenly, I think, he's approaching the biblical creation account and saying that because it's not presented in a scientific paper style, like Moses is going to write out like a scientific paper and present charts and tables and like footnotes or something, like since it's not written in that style, it's not presenting apodictic truth or something like that. But that's not even what we say about the creation account, right? So the fact that it says God created in 6 days, rested the seventh day, created Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden. Like, what about that is against, quote, science, right? Because the way that we're going to determine what's possible in our worldview will depend upon the presuppositions of our worldview, you see. So from the outset, what Jordan should have done, is what I did in the debate with Matt, is question the presuppositions, right? So instead of shifting into trying to kind of water down the Genesis account, I would have gone for Matt's presuppositions. That's what I did, right, in our debate. And Matt didn't know what to do with that and just kept saying, well, you can't justify or prove something that's a transcendental category presupposition, which is a fundamental philosophical mistake because transcendental arguments are a type of logical argument. They can be proven. So he didn't know where to go with that. And I think if Jordan had thought about this more and had more of a logical presentation as opposed to this kind of stream of consciousness all over the place, like watering down the thing to try to make it palatable to, fallen man, that's why this doesn't work, right? What does Paul say? Paul says that the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they can't see the kingdom or believe, right? Paul says that we take every thought captive to Christ. So there's nothing autonomous. There's nothing neutral that you can appeal to.
It's like, I feel for the fundamentalists, because what they're trying to do, to give them credit, is to maintain a corpus of stories in which an ethos is based. That would be the Western ethos, in this case of Christianity, because they believe that the ethos is of extreme value. And I also...
Now, this is worth commenting on because Jordan, of course, equates... Now, he knows about Orthodox Christianity, and this might have been around the time he was maybe newly exposed to it, so maybe he didn't know to not restrict Christianity to the Western ethos. Roman Catholicism is not the summation of what Christianity is, right? But certainly elements of Christianity obviously have influenced the Western ethos. So, okay, but the other real mistake here is about fundamentalism, right? And if you want to know more specifically about the problem with using this phrase or term, go to the talk I did about 4 years ago critiquing the overly allegorical approach of Father Stephen Freeman, which is still on my channel. You have to dig back a little while, but Jordan is doing the same thing there, where the idea is that, look, these Old Testament stories, they're not actual events, okay? They're allegorical, crazy tales that we just kind of have to, find a moral meaning in the midst of, this kind of stuff, right? Now, this is a confusion, and if you disagree, they'll say, oh, you're a fundamentalist, right? Now, this is a confusion between a hermeneutical error and a question of textual issues, okay? Hermeneutics is the interpretation of text. So, for example, in the Orthodox Church, in the history of the Church, both East and West, for the first 1,000 years, especially as you get up into the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, you get what's called the fourfold sense of Scripture. And this is a kind of loose pattern that many of the Church Fathers, basing themselves on the apostolic hermeneutic, kind of deduced as to ways to understand the levels of the text. And the first level is the literal historical. And on that, you build the other layers, which are like the analogical and then anagogical and then allegorical, right? So you can have these different layers of meaning that relate to morals, that relate to eschatology, and then that relate to allegory, right? And Paul does this in Galatians 4, where he makes an allegory about the story of Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah. But if you notice in Paul's allegory, he doesn't ahistoricize Genesis. He actually bases the allegory on the reality of the historical events. And that's the key here. By the way, if you read Maximus the Confessor's book, Ad Thalassium, the Catholic University Press that has the Father Maximus introduction, the introduction notes that very point about Maximus. Maximus never dehistoricized or made the historical events ahistorical. He would base any allegorization on the reality of the history. And he notes that and admits that in that introductory chapter and essay. Likewise, if you read the Father Seraphim Rose book, there's multiple quotes where Father Rose points out this very point. Father Seraphim says that he has some great quotes from St. Cyril of Alexandria about the fact that you can't take allegory to make the historical not real. And I know this is hard for people to fathom, but if somebody like Jordan really ought to spend maybe a year in this or in the Church Fathers if he really wanted to know how to get out of this quandary of modernism and modernity.
I also believe that the ethos is of extreme value and that it is nested in those stories. And so they don't like to be confronted by the rationalist, atheist, evolutionary types because it blows the foundation of their ethos apart and they feel that it's worth preserving. And I think, well, yeah, it is worth preserving. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't philosophical problems associated with the manner in which they construct their arguments. But, well
what I'd like
they're
is to
still
find-
worthy. But it doesn't address the issue. There's a deep issue here that we're not contending with. Here's an example. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think so. I just finished. Well, I thought about it a lot, and I do try to think about where I'm wrong because I would like to figure out where I'm wrong because then I wouldn't have to be wrong anymore, right? And being wrong is actually not a good thing. You fall into a pit if you're wrong.
And this is what I point out in the lecture on skepticism, since you didn't get to see the show, is that being wrong feels exactly like being right.
By the way, it's pages 39, 40, 41 that touch on the point I just made.
Nobody runs around going, oh, I'm wrong, but I'm going to keep believing this. We all assume that we are correct about a great many things. And it's not so much that being wrong is the thing we're afraid of. I think that being exposed as wrong is the thing we're afraid of.
I also wanted to read this quote from St. Cyril, which comes up often. And since St. Cyril's making this point about hermeneutics, St. Cyril says in Questions on John, this is page 123 in the Father Seraphim Rose book, he says, in Galatians 4:24, it is explained that the apostle wrote this not to reject the historical facts, but to relate the type to the reality. St. Cyril writes in Questions on John 1 that one cannot apprehend rightly the scriptures if one attempts to contemplate their spiritual meaning without respecting the historical meaning. Quote, those who reject the historical meaning of the scriptures in the God-inspired texts as something obsolete are avoiding the ability to apprehend rightly. According to the proper manner, the things which are written in them. For indeed, spiritual contemplation is good and profitable, and it enlightens the eyes of the eyes of reason, especially well. It reveals the wisest of things. For whenever some historical event is apprehended to us in the scriptures, In that instance, a useful search into the historical meaning is appropriate in order that the God-inspired scriptures be revealed as salvific and beneficial to us in every way. And then Father Rose has multiple texts there where he finds other church fathers illustrating the same point, which is just simply that it just doesn't work to, take the allegory as the rejector of the historicity. This is a false presupposition. Every biblical allegory, in the sense of allegories built on historical events, I'm talking about. Sometimes allegories are using mythical imagery or some purely symbolic imagery, sure, but you can't say, oh well, then Genesis is purely symbolic because it doesn't jibe with what I think science says. But you see, Jesus trumps what science says, right? Because Jesus says that Adam and Eve were historical people, right? If Adam and Eve and the events of Genesis weren't historical, then there's not a basis for marriage, right, as a grounded in nature, you could say, contract. Why do we have marriage? Right? This is an argument Dr. Lyle uses, which I think is a powerful argument. And by the way, how is Jesus the second Adam? If Adam and Eve were just sort of, evolved figures. Now, again, a lot of people say, well, I can't accept that. I'm not going to believe this religion, and they move on. But to try to blend this religion with something that's completely contrary to the account is just disastrous, right? I mean, it's not going to work. The whole redemptive scheme will fall apart.
Well, we're also sometimes afraid of being wrong, because if you're wrong at a deep level, it can really hurt you.
Oh, I agree.
It can really take you apart. And so people don't like to be taken apart. Like if you're wrong about your wife, for example, that tends to be a very painful thing. And that's something that's worth pursuing to try to figure out why that is.
That's why I hide the frying pan.
Boomer joke.
That should make you popular. Okay, so one of the issues that I have, and you can respond to this, is that the let's say the celebrity atheist types, because I actually like that phrase, they don't seem to me to be contending with the real issues. They seem to be going
What are the real issues?
Dostoevsky.
This is a weird turn. I think from a rhetoric perspective, it's interesting that, Jordan is throwing in literary things, right? What's the real issues? You think Jordan's going to say something philosophical, and he says Dostoevsky, right? Dostoevsky's existential dilemma of man and Raskolnikov and A Crime and Punishment, or Notes from the Underground, or something like this. Yeah, that's actually a good point, but outside of rhetoric, it's not really a good argument. It doesn't prove or disprove anything really when you're appealing to. And I understand it from the rhetorical perspective, right? If I was in the midst of debate, I might say, consider the great figures like Dostoevsky, right? My favorite author, right? He asks questions about man's dilemma, and then, maybe that could be a segue into an argument. But just to talk about the fact that man has these kind of existential crises and dilemmas, this sort of stream of consciousness approach is it's almost all rhetoric, right? It's like I'm not hearing any actual substantive argument yet in all of this stream of consciousness talking that he's doing. It's like Veganica, right? The so-called debate, right? Quote, debate. No arguments, just sort of talking. Give it's like a beat poet or something, like the poets that do, freestyling or something, right? Okay, freestyling is not an argument, right? We need a substantive argument here, and we've not gotten it yet.
He's a real issue. Tolstoy, he's a real issue. Carl Jung,
Tolstoy's
20
terrible,
books
by the
and
way.
maybe 15 seminars. He's a real issue.
Okay, so Dostoevsky is a real issue. Tolstoy is a real issue. Carl Jung, 20 books and his seminars is a real issue. What? If I was an atheist, like a atheist logician, right? Which that position is completely ridiculous. And I'm hearing this, I'm thinking, this is an argument? This is preposterous. Like, what are you talking about? So I think what he's trying to say is that why would writers ask really difficult questions and tell amazing narratives if this wasn't really, if they weren't hitting on something. Okay, but what are they hitting on, right? I mean, are they grappling with God? Yeah, to a degree, especially crime and punishment. Yeah, so maybe that's what his argument is. By the way, who wants to read Tolstoy? Give me a break. Garbage, right?
Mircea Eliade. Like, there are some serious heavy hitters.
Now, Eliade is an interesting writer, right? I've read Sacred and the Profane. I've got his book on shamanism over there, which is a fascinating book. I've got his book on Nietzsche. I've got Johann Kuliano, which was his mentor or his student, however it goes. I've got Eliade's whole 3-volume series on the history of religion. Yeah, there's some really awesome, amazing, fascinating comparative religion in Eliade, but this shotgun, machine gun approach of appealing to like literary comparative religion psychology figures is just bizarre.
Hitters in the religious phenomenology domain. And my sense so far.
By the way, let's make a distinction too between people who get into the Bible or orthodoxy via the route of perennialism, Eliade, comparative religion, Carl Jung. Yes, that happens. But that has nothing to do with whether the arguments are good or whether Christianity is true or false. Right? The route that you came to something has literally nothing to do with the validity of the argument being made. I mean, it's fascinating. It's unique to you and your existential history and story, right? Your origin story. But it's not anything approaching an argument.
I just finished reading all of Harris's books, for example. He doesn't contend with them at all. And it's like, for me, that's like being an...
Okay, but why should Sam Harris contend with those figures? Because they're popular? I mean, does that mean Sam Harris should contend with Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, Billie Eilish? I mean, they're popular. Is popularity what we're supposed to... And Jordan say, "Oh no, their intellectual product, what they produced intellectually." And I'm like, there's an infinite variety of intellectual products out there, and the fact that some people are popular has literally nothing to do with the truth or falsity of the claim. So Matt is correct to kind of sit back and just let this emotional appeal to like. It's not really No True Scotsman. It's kind of like, and it's not exactly an emotional appeal. It's a version of emotional appeal where it's like, if you really want to be an intellectual or a deep thinker, you would deal with this, right? And it's just, that's a fallacy.
An evolutionary biologist and not being aware of Darwin. It's actually a big problem. It's not something you can hand wave away. Jung was a mystic. It's like, sorry.
Okay, but what Jordan's not going for is the fact that from Matt's worldview, from Matt's perspective, he doesn't care about literary greats. He doesn't care about psychological Carl Jung, dream analysis. He doesn't see that as having any value really, aside from however it can be translated into his reductionism. So if you're dealing with a reductionist, to machine gun throw at him a bunch of cool books that you read. You read Lord of the Rings, bro? Like, they don't care. That's just stories. And they don't realize that they're telling a story, but that's the thing is that what I tried to do, and maybe I should have just said this, like to Matt, is that Matt, you don't realize that in your attempt to get away from storytelling, aka Christianity, and your adoption of skeptical materialism, atheism, you're just telling another story. But it's an even stupider story because it has less grounding, and not only less grounding, it can't ground anything at all. It's completely arbitrary and ad hoc. And he admitted that, and he's like, but so what? Okay, well, thank you. That's the end of the debate. Once you admit that your arguments are arbitrary and ad hoc, all I have to do is respond by saying, then God just is. Right? If you can be ad hoc, I can be ad hoc. And that's why you can't do that in a debate, obviously.
He was about as smart as Friedrich Nietzsche.
I think this gets to basically the same.
So this is it's unbelievable to me that Jordan would make this kind of an argument. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but he's saying, I forget who he listed. Who was his last one? Was it Eliade was the last one? He says Eliade is at least as smart as Nietzsche. Okay, but Matt doesn't care about Nietzsche. I mean, Matt may like the fact that Nietzsche is an atheist, but Matt doesn't care about who amongst the world's prized literary figures has a high IQ. And by the way, Matt is actually correct to say that that's all irrelevant. Who cares? Like, it's interesting that certain people have high IQs, but that's really just a kind of weird appeal to popularity and an appeal to authority. I'd say, so what Jordan is doing is this rhetoric that is a combination of three fallacies, right? No true intellectual would ignore these people. That's no true Scotsman fallacy. He's doing a version of the emotional appeal that, you can't really call yourself a thinker or an intellectual or a strong, minded person until you've dealt with these heavy hitters. That's an emotional appeal. So it's kind of a blending of these fallacies. And it's, interesting from a rhetorical perspective, I guess. But, from a logical debate perspective, Matt really doesn't have to. Matt can just say, yeah, that's all irrelevant. So that's nice and flowery language, Jordan, but it's not an argument.
Same point I was talking about before. The thing that you're objecting to, it seems, is that many of us don't want to address the aspects of religion that you find value in, because we're only focused on, perhaps as I'm talking in the show, from a scientific skepticism perspective of, are there valid and sound arguments that would lead one to conclude that a God exists?
Right. So basically, Matt is saying what I said, and this is, I think, the correct response. Now, I'm not saying Matt is right, but I'm saying in terms of his worldview. But this response to Jordan is correct, which is that, that flowery language and appeal was not an argument.
My answer to this so far seems to be no. And the apologists, the theologians, they keep presenting the arguments, the teleological arguments, moral arguments, and all these things. They have nothing to...
Which is correct. And Matt is correct to respond that the rehashing of all of those 17th century arguments is a waste of time, medieval, and that's why we do the transcendental argument. And if you watch the debate with Matt, you'll notice that Matt was not prepared for the transcendental argument and didn't know how to respond, and just basically said, look, logic just is, it's immaterial, it just is, I can't justify it, no one can, it just is. Right? So that's when the debate was over, was that if you are ad hoc in a debate, you've lost the debate.
Nothing to do with the phenomenology of religion. They have nothing to do with how this impacts people's lives. This is a question of, is it in fact the case? Is it consistent with reality that there is a God? And is it consistent with reality that there is good reason to believe?
Now, this is a little bit of a bait and switch on Matt's part, because Matt doesn't believe that he can know what is consistent with reality. Now, he will say he believes and has good reason to believe that sense data that comes into his mind matches up to the external world, to reality, but he cannot justify or know that that actually is the case, because ever since David Hume, no one can. You can posit it. You can say you think it's true. You can say that maybe there's a lot of likelihood that sense data matches up to the external world, or quote reality. But when you've excluded metaphysics from your worldview, which is what all skeptical worldviews do, to then turn around and make these atrocious metaphysical claims that claims must match up to reality, is to make a really stupid basic move and mistake. It's a really stupid basic mistake, right? And yes, Matt does not believe you can do metaphysics, but he doesn't even know that saying that sense data matches up with reality, or that we must match sense data up with reality, which presupposes that he knows or has access to reality, right? That's a metaphysical claim. He doesn't even know that.
to believe there's God. That is where the focus is primarily.
Yeah, and it's usually construed as
deny.
a scientific issue.
Well, it's not so. I would never construe it as a scientific issue because science can't confirm the supernatural. I mean,
This is once again the silliness of Matt's skepticism and his ignorance of philosophy, which is that to say that science cannot prove or confirm the existence of the supernatural is not really to be consistent with the rest of what science cannot do, which is to prove anything immaterial or invariant. And remember, in many of Matt's debates, he will stress and say you should not believe in anything outside of having empirical bases to believe in it. Well, guess what? The scientific method is not empirically based. I'm saying the method itself. Doing science involves empirical sense data. But the idea of knowing things through sense data, we only know what's true through sense data. Basic empiricism cannot be proven through sense data. The proposition, the belief itself, don't you get that? And the low IQ atheists will come here and be like, it is because you do it. Because you do it. Right? Induction cannot be proven through sense data. How do you prove induction? You can't, right? And that's what David Hume called out a long time ago. And I raised all these questions in the debate with Matt, and it just goes, he completely clueless, never gets it. And that's why he had to have two PhD buddies come on and help him out in their debate review, because he didn't know how to respond. Because he thought that he was going to be debating another goofball Matt Slick, right, who is a crazy person. And no, he was actually debating somebody who could make the argument.
we are blocked until somebody demonstrates a mechanism by which we can explore and confirm the existence of the supernatural, and then confirm that it actually can impact the natural world.
So, Matt, what is the mechanism by which we can confirm and explore that the scientific method itself is universal, invariant, and exists and is true? Oh, yeah, there's not one. Yeah. So everything that Matt says turns back on Matt himself. Matt cannot justify any of the things he believes in. He cannot give a grounding, an account, or an explanation for them. Pragmatic appeals to them working is not a justification. It's not an account. It's circularity. Now, if he wants to admit circular arguments, I would be glad to welcome him into the camp of making his way towards transcendental arguments. But Matt is coming out of the Enlightenment tradition of scientism and empiricism, and they don't do circular arguments, right? They don't admit circularity. They don't believe in paradigms. And thus you can see he's locked into a problem. Everything that Matt is requiring of his opponent, he cannot do by his own strictures within his own worldview and paradigm.
We're stuck, which is why science relies on methodological naturalism.
You seem to be able-
This is literally some of the most childish things that people in this whole Reddit atheism sphere appeal to. Methodological naturalism. Like one class in philosophy of science would expose you to the basic level, basic bitch critiques of reductionism, methodological naturalism, basic bitch empiricism. Okay. But I really genuinely think, and I'm not trying to be rude, I think that the debate that I had with Matt was the first time he's ever heard like a basic philosophical critique of basic bitch empiricism and methodological naturalism and reductionism, because he was totally off guard. And when you read the comments, his Reddit tier atheist crowd, like they don't even know they were lost. They had no idea what's going on. They think that the transcendental argument is just saying God exists, right? Like they're lost, or they have no idea what's going on.
Be able to do it with psychedelic drugs.
Here's where it gets
Seem to be able
weird.
to do what with psychedelic drugs?
Well, everybody that takes them and under reliable.
It's really sad that like famous debates, that these are the representatives of famous debates in our day. Like this is like, so now Jordan's going into the whole Tim Leary argument for God. I mean, like, and this is just going to get really bizarre. And Matt will, I think, have the upper hand at this point.
Settings generally comes back and claims the presence of a mystical experience.
Yeah,
and that
but-
seems to be duplicatable and replicable across cultures in labs with multiple different substances, the chemical constituents of which are known very well. It's like it's part of this religious phenomenology. And to me, that's just a set of facts And we know that people have been using those substances to evoke mystical and religious experiences for, who knows, 150,000 years maybe. Sure. We can at least infer that. And we have no idea whatsoever how much of an effect the use of those substances has had on the metaphysical substrate of our culture. Like, so what constitutes scientific data?
Okay, so oof. It's really weird. So the use of drugs, mysticism, LSD experiences, we don't know what effect that has had on the metaphysical substrate of our society. I think Jordan believes in Carl Jung's collective unconscious, and so I'm not positive where he's going, but I think he thinks that maybe that we've begun to experience with psychedelics in the last, since the 60s may have changed like the consciousness of something. Like, how this is an argument, I have no idea. I don't know. Like, it's a piece of data about what some people do. And Matt is correct to say that I can't verify that any of this means anything, right? Because, for example, drug experiences can be totally gibberish, right? I mean, they can produce, almost like schizophrenia level types of worlds and experiences. And to say that is like somehow a message or meaningful, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So it's just another terrible argument. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out if there's a way that you could take the drug experience stuff and I mean, you could make it anecdotal. You could make it part of, it's a weird thing. Hey, it's a weird thing. It's a mysterious thing that people have drug experiences, and shamans throughout history have, gone to the shaman world and, done the, booty rituals, and it's all really fascinating. But again, not an argument. And I just don't, it's just really a big, I don't know. I'm just baffled really by this.
Data here is by no means clear. Here's an example of this, for example. So,
before the example, as someone...
By the way, a lot of people's experiences on LSD are meaningless. A lot of them are conflicting. One guy does LSD, has a mystical experience, and believes he's Jesus. One guy does LSD and jumps off the water tower, right? One guy does LSD and maybe he, gets his life together and has a real repentance experience because he, saw something hellacious. I don't know. But all of these conflicting experiences are not going to be a way to prove or disprove anything. They're just pieces of evidence, right, within a larger framework or paradigm. It's like a worse version of the resurrection argument, right? Jesus is what's that stupid evangelical argument where it's like liar, Lord, lunatic. Jesus is either a liar, a Lord, or a lunatic, and if you investigate the evidence, you will come to the conclusion of one of those three things. If you come to believe that Jesus is a lunatic, I at least appreciate that you investigated the evidence. These are terrible arguments. No wonder people choose atheism with these retard arguments, right?
Who's been high as a kite. I fully agree that people take drugs and report...
It's a bit of a stoner laugh there on the part of Jordan, right? Dude, bro, I just had a sweet bong ride, dude. The stoner laugh, right?
Experiences that they describe as mystical or supernatural. Just like people report other experiences as if they were religious or ghosts or whatever. We have no way of confirming that this something mystical or supernatural actually happened. What this is about the language.
Stops people from smoking.
Well, you can stop smoking.
I mean, a car wreck, right? Like a traumatic event could stop me from smoking. I mean, this is just such a bizarre argument.
Without any sort of supernatural intervention.
No, not really.
You can't stop smoking without
There
supernatural?
aren't really any reliable chemical means for inducing smoking cessation. You can use a drug called bupropion. I think that's the one.
A drug
Whatever
called what?
Wellbutrin is.
That doesn't even sound like a real drug. Bupropion. What was Alex's thing the other day? Like, I'm sick of sorcerers and wizards and pumpkin popsum, right? Does pumpkin popsum take bupropion or whatever Jordan's talking about?
Is that supernatural?
No, you don't need a supernatural effect, but it doesn't work very well. But if you give people magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and they have a mystical experience, they have about an 85% chance of smoking cessation
Sure,
with
but-
one treatment.
but
Yeah,
that-
but that's kind of like evidence, you know.
Evidence of what? Right? I mean, so Jordan's argument is that you can't really stop smoking without supernatural aid. I don't think that that's the case at all. Plenty of people who don't believe in God or any kind of can quit smoking. This is just one of the weirdest, goofiest arguments I think I've ever heard. Now, it doesn't prove anything, but does it at least suggest that there might be something more going on in high level, hallucinogen experiences? Yeah, okay. I could buy that. It's just such a weird argument and doesn't prove anything.
It's kind of like evidence.
It's
And
evidence that you can take.
It's kind of like evidence, and Matt will say it's evidence that you could take to mean anything or something even. I mean, there's no reason to believe that it's supernatural, which evidences are interpreted within a paradigm, and that's what Jordan doesn't understand, right? Like, and if what he should do is call Matt out on what is evidence. You can't have evidence without a paradigm, because all evidence is theory laden. So you need a theory to situate evidence. Right? If we convince an atheist that maybe a long time ago Jesus rose from the dead, a consistent atheist can say, okay, so what? Weird things happen. Because the resurrection of Christ only has the meaning and significance that it has in the Christian paradigm. Other people in the Bible rose from the dead, right? So you need the rest of the story to see that, Jesus' resurrection is actually the fulfillment of all these Old Testament prophecies, right? You need the whole context, right? So just the event of a, quote, resurrection, maybe Jesus was like a zombie, right? Like he took pufferfish toxin and he gave the appearance of passing out for 3 days, and then he awoke and people thought he was resurrected, right? I mean, I'm not saying I believe that. I'm just saying that one piece of the evidence sliced out of the entire paradigm, putting that before a person doesn't do or prove anything. And the fact that many atheists may have been convinced of Christianity on the basis of a bad argument also doesn't prove anything, right? The fact that an argument works sometimes is irrelevant to whether it's a good argument, whether it's a sound argument.
Take mushrooms and increase your chance of quitting smoking. But
No, it's not. It's indication that if you take mushrooms and you have a mystical experience, you'll stop smoking, because it doesn't work if you don't have
if
the
you take
experience.
mushrooms and you
This is literally one of the dumbest arguments ever, I think.
have an experience that you describe as mystical, then you'll increase your chance of smoking. But that doesn't tell me whether or not there was something.
I didn't think there could be a worse argument than the resurrection argument that the evangelicals make, but I think this one tops it.
This notion that they had an experience that was supernatural in any sense.
Well, it's not definitive evidence.
It's not evidence at all.
Oh, sure it is. Oh, sure it is.
No,
How is it? Wait a sec.
I mean, evidence of what? Evidence of, again, you need a paradigm, a story to make sense of any piece of evidence. And from Jordan's paradigm, this story, this evidence is telling him that a mystical experience is some kind of tapping into a metaphysical substrate that could help you stop smoking. How does that what if Satan is helping you to stop smoking, right? Like maybe Satan wants to use you for the satanic kingdom, and so he grants everybody that has the mushroom initiation the power to stop smoking so that they can live a life of pure Satanism. You see what I'm saying? Like, this argument is terrible.
Wait a second. That's wrong.
Okay.
It is evidence. So, because look,
no, he's right.
You want to speak,
He's right.
you want to think through
I will
this
correct that.
Well, it is evidence. Of what? Right? This is the fallacy of neutrality, right? The idea that evidence, quote unquote, comes to you outside of a theory, outside of a paradigm, right? It comes in a vacuum. It's a brute fact, right? You just look at the earthworm and you know what's up, right? You just look at the data of the mystical experiences and it just tells you what's up. No, data, evidence has to be interpreted just like anything else is interpreted in life. Think of life like a book, right? What do we call the icons? They're written, they're books, they're written. Icons are not painted, they're written. Why? Because it's just like this book, except it's different types of symbols than this book. Now, think of all of life. All the events and objects and things that come before your spatio-temporal view throughout your life. The people, the places, the events, the books, the experiences, the anger, those are like a book. And they have to be interpreted. There's different kinds of things. But in a certain perspective, from a semiotic perspective, it's like a big long book going before you. It's like a movie. Think of a movie. When we watch a movie, right? Let's say I'm watching a movie. I'm watching, I don't know, what am I watching? Watching Blade Runner. And I see Roy Batty with the dove, okay? Does Roy Batty with the dove make sense to me if I haven't seen the whole story of Blade Runner? No. Okay? It doesn't make it. What I don't know, is this a Christian image? Like, is Roy Batty a Pentecostal, like posing symbolically with a dove to show that he's empowered by the Azusa Street revival? No, I mean, who knows, right? What does this mean? It only makes sense within the context of the story of Blade Runner. And what I'm trying to say to you is that Jordan really could have done more with this story mythos approach that he's got if he situated it like that, to explain that, Matt, you're telling a story. You thought that you were leaving empirist religion for something rational and more sophisticated and high-minded, but you're just telling another story. And guess what? Your story is more retarded than the evangelical story. That's what Matt can't put up with or hear.
Skeptically, okay, you have a pharmacological substance, it's psilocybin. You give it to people who are trying to quit smoking. The psilocybin doesn't directly have an impact on the smoking behavior. It has to elicit what's described subjectively as a mystical experience. And you can get physiological indicators of that mystical experience. And you might say, well, that's not enough to prove that it's a mystical experience, but, you're conscious and I accept that. It's like you accept all sorts of things.
This is I don't know where this goes. It's out there, dog. This is going out there. Before we go out there, one thing I would like to comment on this, because this comes up a lot with Muslims and the atheists. Right now, I don't know how they think that the revelations, quote unquote, to Muhammad escaped this challenge, but somehow in the Muslim mind, they think that Paul's claim of being called as an apostle in the book of Acts is subject to this intense critique. You can't critique Muhammad's claims, right, because of their presuppositions, obviously. But what would we say to this kind of a critique that I'm giving of Jordan's argument in relation to St. Paul? Am I not in the same dilemma, right? Oh, haha, I've got you, because if mystical experiences don't relate to religion or don't prove the religion, then how do you affirm St. Paul? Bro, I got you, dude. And you will hear this argument come up quite often. Perhaps even Jordan, if I was talking to Jordan, perhaps he would even say,
Well, then you can't listen to Paul, right? Paul's got a mystical experience. Perhaps he was on shrooms.
right? No. When we look at Paul, this is unique and different because of the fact that Paul himself spends most of his epistles and arguments proving continuity. This is key. This is key. Because any new revelation, remember, Deuteronomy 13, Deuteronomy 18, two important chapters in Deuteronomy that lay out the pattern of what will be expected of any future prophet. And the prophet, in the sense of Deuteronomy 18, the prediction of the coming, quote, prophet, capital P, which is Jesus. It's not talking about Muhammad. It's a prediction of Christ as the coming true prophet. And Deuteronomy 13 laying out the strictures of when to know if a prophet is true or false. And what is the basic pattern that is given. Any new revelation, any new prophetic word, quote unquote, that comes has to be consistent with previous revelation. There will be no new revelations or prophetic lineage or preachers or apostles or whatever that contradict the correct interpretation of Moses, Isaiah, etc. This is a fundamental argument that all the Jews had, right? That's why Jesus and Paul are constantly arguing about whether they are in continuity with the Old Testament, because everybody assumes that you have to be. Yes, absolutely. Whether it's the Pharisees, whether it's Jesus, whether it's Paul, everybody agrees, yes, you have to be consistent with what came before. You can't be, because of Deuteronomy 13 and Deuteronomy 18. It lays down this stricture. And God says, if they don't teach according to this law, you know they're a false prophet. Stone them, get rid of them. They have the death penalty, blah, blah, blah. Right? That's what was laid down then as the measure. So Paul, throughout most of his apologetic, is constantly trying to demonstrate and show that he is in continuity with previous revelation. And he does. He shows that very fluently, consistently in Romans, in Galatians. Tradition says he wrote Hebrews, right? Paul makes that case forcefully when you have a holistic understanding of what Paul wrote, right? You can't just take one thing he wrote and try to, I read Galatians and, because it's a holistic thing, right? Read all of Paul's writings and see if he's consistent with the law of Moses and the prophets. And he is. That's why Christianity is true, because Paul is consistent. He's consistent with Jesus. So what does he say in Galatians that makes this point? In Galatians 1, Paul repeats the dictum of Deuteronomy 13 and Deuteronomy 18 about a true prophet. Now, not word for word, I'm saying that Paul, being studied in the law, sitting at the feet of Gamaliel, he knew what was in the law. He quotes the law and the prophets all the time. And Paul says in Galatians 1, if an angel from heaven or anyone who claims to be in continuity with me and Jesus, if they come to you and they teach differently than what you've heard taught, then you know they're a false prophet. Paul is repeating Deuteronomy 13 and 18, that dictum there. And so what I'm saying is that when you do understand the Bible, when you do understand the law of Moses and the prophets, you see the continuity. It's very clear. And Paul is not teaching some crazy new gospel different than Jesus. That's how we know Paul's revelation is legitimate, not because he just claims to have a revelation. It's a fundamental stupid mistake that a lot of people make. They say, why would you follow Paul? He's a mystic. I follow Jesus, not Paul. Right? Well, Jesus claims to be God. Jesus claims to read the Gospel of John, right? So just really ignorant mistakes, ignorance of the Old Testament, actually. It's a huge problem, really. Now, let's get back to Jordan here. But so that would be the way I would respond to the people who will kind of pull out this argument of, well, if you don't listen to mystical experiences, you got to give up Paul in the New Testament.
Things without being able to demonstrate their validity on every possible objective, with every possible objective criteria. So don't get in too much of a hurry. It's a serious issue. If you give people psilocybin, for example, and they have a mystical experience, not only are they much more likely to quit smoking, which is really something, but they're also much less likely to suffer from death anxiety if they have cancer. Like, that's quite the thing. And not only that, if you test them a year later and they've had a mystical experience, which the majority of them regard as the most significant one, two, or three.
So running through this whole approach of Jordan is a pragmatic utilitarian assumption, right? If religion helps people, if religion soothes you on the deathbed, if mystical experiences and shrooms, help you quit smoking, right? It's as if it's a self-help program, right? And I mean, I guess from a psychological perspective, you could understand why he might view it that way. But that's not Christianity, right? Christianity is not a self-help program. There might be aspects of living the Christian life which are obviously beneficial and helpful and healthful to you. Healthy, yeah, sure. But that's not what this is. This is not a Joel Osteen, Carl Jung, Norman Vincent Peale positive thinking rehab program.
Or three experiences of their life, including such things as getting married, their personalities are permanently altered in the direction of more openness to experience and more creativity by a standard deviation. Like, that's walloping effects. So we can't get too much in a hurry about dispensing with all that.
Skepticism, as I repeatedly point out in the show, is not about cynicism. It's not about debunking. And I'm not saying that
that is not true. Who in their right mind believes that skepticism is not about debunking? Debunking. Right, come on. Matt, all you people do is attempt to debunk at a pathological level. Now, there is healthy skepticism, right? What have we been doing the last week? Debunking alien bull crap, right? We've been debunking. Nothing wrong with debunking. The problem is that Michael Shermer, the skeptic crowd, pathologically debunk and skepticize to the extent that they are nothing but mouthpieces of the establishment, right? Imagine being a, quote, skeptic, Michael Shermer, and never disagreeing with the establishment on anything, right? Neil deGrasse Tyson promotes literally 95% of what the establishment says. Now, that to me is not debunking and skepticism. That's pathological skepticism, which suggests that they're actually just appendages of the establishment themselves. Literally. The science heroes, the scientism proponents, are literally just shills. Literally. They don't know anything about philosophy. Literally. I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson says philosophy is worthless.
there is no supernatural and that there is no mystical experience. What I'm saying is...
What is he talking about? This is pure rhetoric bullshit. Matt saying that skepticism is not about debunking? What? That's all you guys do, right? And sometimes you do debunk real bull crap. But, I mean, Matt, nobody's going to believe that. Come on. This is like when they say atheism is not about denying the existence of God. Like this, which is all just rhetoric. Like they sound, this is supposed to be profound, right? Like atheists never deny the existence of God. We just can't confirm that there is a God. No, you always argue that there is no God. This is just a play on words, right? Where they do this like bait and switch thing, where they kind of move back and forth between agnosticism and hardline atheism, and they do that all the time. That's just like their shiftiness, though.
The thing that people subjectively describe as, I had an incredibly impactful mystical experience, whether it comes from taking a pharmaceutical, whether it comes from attending a revival church service or hearing a particular preacher, whether it comes from having a particularly impressive sexual experience, all of those things.
I don't know about that one. I have a hard time believing that Matt's had a lot of those. I'm just joking. That was a joke.
That is the subjective description of that, which may be because of limitations in language, that they don't have any other. This is the language that infuses culture, so that we have to use that to describe it. But that doesn't in any way serve to confirm that there is any sort of supernatural realm or any sort of...
That is correct. The way Jordan presented this pragmatic utilitarian argument does not prove it is a non sequitur. So, Matt, if you don't know the philosophy terms, that's called a non sequitur. You should have just called it that. I would have just said non sequitur.
Supernatural actor.
Well, it depends on how you define supernatural. Like, look, I get your point.
Okay.
And I'm not claiming.
Depends on how you define it. Depends on what you mean.
Right, here's the fallback of what Jordan always does, which is to take the word that's being debated and muddy its meaning as if we don't know what the supernatural is, right? Like, so now supernatural can mean or be equated to a drug experience, and the fact that there's evidence after the drug experience that a person quit smoking. I mean, this is just terrible arguments. Just god-awful arguments here.
That the phenomena of psilocybin intoxication is direct proof for the existence of God. I'm not saying that. I am saying
Although that'd be awesome.
Boomer joke.
Well, people do report personal experiences of that sort of thing. So it's not completely out of the realm of the experience. But it's also because of the problem of the border between the subjective and the objective. It's difficult to probe deeply enough to come up with anything definitive. You know, and I understand
Probe deeply. I see what he said, dude.
that's a problem. But the supernatural issue, that's a different issue. Like, people are capable of entering different experiential.
Okay, so if it's a different issue and it's difficult to delineate between the subjective and the objective in the sense of the mystical experience tapping into another world, why are you bringing this up as an argument? Like, if it's not clear, then you're appealing to something really unclear as an argument. And if it's not an argument, then why are you bringing it to the debate, bro?
Realms where things are qualitatively different to them. The perceptions are different, the thoughts are different.
I think this was like with the vegan atheists from a few months ago, where people, or the woman yesterday, people think that debate is just a thing where you yell at people, or you like make jokes and you just say things back and forth. Like, you're dumb, you're stupid, you're fat, you're ugly, you're a fart, you too, you're a mom, right? Like, as if a debate is just doing that for a long time and just saying things. Like, I had an experience one time and I took acid and your mom is stupid, and by the way, God exists. Like, just talking is a debate. That's not what a debate is. Okay, there's rules, there's laws, there's fallacies, there's rhetoric. Rhetoric is part of a debate. But if your whole debate is rhetoric, I have to say, Jordan, I'm sorry, but so far, it's all rhetoric. No arguments yet, all rhetoric. Matt, who is the king of rhetoric and no arguments, actually has had more argumentation to this point in the debate. So far, we're going to have to give the debate to Matt at this point. All right, now, maybe things are going to change. Maybe it'll slide over into the other direction. We'll see, but again, a debate has to have agreed upon rules. Now, I'm not saying the agreed upon rules are a social construct. Right? This is what a lot of idiot atheists think, that, like JF thinks that when you come to the debate, you agree on the rules, and so it's a will to power thing. And since he doesn't accept your will to power attack on him, he's not going to agree to your rules. I mean, that's not what a debate is. Okay, a debate means that there's objective laws of logic that people have to believe in and agree to. They really exist, by the way. They're not just made up in your head. They're rules of thought. And they dictate why you can't come to the debate and say fallacies. I mean, you can physically do it, but it's not going to win the day. It's not going to give you the argument. You're not going to win your case. You're going to lose. Okay. I mean, the level of dumb that we're dealing with here is like when I was talking to those vegan atheists and they're like, you're telling me that I can't physically come to the debate and do a fallacy. And I'm like, dude, no, you can do nothing but fallacies if you want to, but they're invalid in terms of argumentation. You know, this is the level of dumb we're dealing with here.
Their response to the world is different. They feel that they've died an ego death and
Okay, so we just covered, as you know, Timothy Leary's whole story of this ego death stuff in his Tibetan Book of the Dead book. Now, you read that book, it's all gibberish, right? It's all nonsense, gibberish, and basically demonic, right? I mean, we covered that in the talk, the Empty Man talk, Tibetan Book of the Dead, Empty Man. And for the subscribers, we just did the part 2 where we finished the rest of the book. And I mean, so Jordan, wait a minute. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the ego death there, according to Tim Leary, and Jordan is citing these Tim Leary types, right? As if this is going to prove something for the religious world. This is modeled on Tibetan Book of the Dead, where all the gods show up and have a goblin god orgy with you and eat you and slice you up, and they're eating people, cannibal, human blood, ritual sacrifice, slicing up your butthole. Okay, literally, that's what's going on. Is that a religious experience that's a good argument for the existence of God? Now, maybe in the sense of like being exposed to the pure demonic, it could drive you to believe in God. Maybe that's the like subtle argument that Jordan is going for here. But I mean, this is just so out there, man. It's just so out there. Contrast this to the Bahnsen-Stein debate, right? I mean, Bahnsen savages Stein in a classic way, through logic, through critiquing Stein's Dillahunty style worldview, right? I mean, Gordon Stein and Dillahunty basically have the same worldview. And look at the way that Bahnsen just savaged that. I mean, just like with a samurai like coming against like the Michelin Man, right? Like a samurai, right? Michelin Man just deflated. And compare that with this bizarre rhetorical, all over the place appeal from Jordan. And by the way, that doesn't mean Matt is necessarily going to win.
And transcended their normal mode of perception. Like, maybe that's not part of the supernatural, but then you're starting to define the supernatural.
Okay, but Jordan, you just conceded there that if it's not part of the supernatural, then you are not arguing for the supernatural. That's what Matt asked for. And so you're saying, well, let me admit that these mystical experiences probably may not be supernatural, but I'll just redefine the word supernatural to mean any kind of mystical experience that you have on a drug trip. And by redefining the words, therefore it's happened. Okay, this is a terrible argument. Okay.
Well, pretty narrowly. Like,
No,
do you require miracle, like here and now? Something that defies the laws of physics? Or what's your definition of the supernatural?
So there is the natural world,
Yeah.
and then there are people who make claims that something is not part of the natural world.
Now, this is what we did in our debate with Matt, which is that we listened to Matt make this big fundamental blunder, and then we asked Matt to simply explain and justify his belief in the natural world, right? Which is a conceptual, meaningful, grand narrative explanation story that's told about what exists and doesn't exist, all this metaphysical stuff. And then Matt says, you can't do metaphysics. Oh, thank you, Matt. You just conceded everything right there. Now, Jordan is lost. He doesn't do or catch any of this.
That it has some
He could have just nailed him right there. And there's another point in the debate where he could just nail Matt on metaphysics, and he doesn't do it. He gets really close.
external supernatural origin. Those are the claims that I don't see how we can make any sort of epistemologically sound confirmation of.
Again, Matt is correct to ask Jordan for epistemologically sound arguments. Correct. And Jordan is not giving them. However, Matt can't justify epistemological soundness because Matt can't justify or explain or ground epistemology at all. Pragmatic appeals are not a justification.
I'm fine with accepting that people have these experiences. I've been, I was, for many, many years, fundamentalist Southern Baptist, and I remember standing in church and feeling what I would have described at the time as the Holy Ghost, sweeping through me. Now, many years later, I look back at that and I say, why did I describe this particular experience?
This is actually an interesting point that I will concede to Matt, that the religious bases that most evangelicals have as to why they believe is emotional appeals, emotional moving experiences, which are not the reason to believe in a religion. Now, those might accompany your religious belief or experience. But this is the reason that evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, charismaticism don't hold people is because the whole of the religious experience is grounded in these emotional highs and lows and roller coasters, right? Jesus, we love you so much that we love you more, and we love you even more than much before. 20,000 times if we repeat this worship song, we'll be less gay, and we'll love you more. Right. On and on and on and on and on. Just gibberish. Praise and worship gibberish, right? It's all nonsense. It's nothing. Why? Because it's all about emotions. That's not what the religious experience is. And that's why I appreciate the Orthodox tendency to ignore the emotional experiences, the dreams, the vision. Prelest is the danger here. When the religion is grounded in prelest, you are on shifting sands, you see. So, correct, Matt. Your feeling of the quote spirit blasting through you was probably a case of gas or lentils or who knows what, right? It wasn't the spirit, because that's not what we say the spirit is. What does Paul say evidence of the spirit is, right? A changed life, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, good. Living and following the 10 Commandments is the evidence of the Holy Spirit.
This way, it's a unique experience. It's of the same quality as something you might experience from a drug, or I've experienced similar things from music and drugs and sex, but they're not all exactly the same. And this is kind of the caveat that the believers, for any one of them, would use is, oh, the thing you're talking about, when you had awesome sex or you were on drugs, that's not the same as what I felt the Holy Spirit. I felt all of them. The reason I would have said at the time that I had been filled with the Holy Spirit is because everybody around me was saying that too. It's not like I have any sort of...
Matt is actually correct here that in that mindset and from that vantage point, a subjective appeal to an experience that you had could be very relevant to you. It could be a legitimate, experience, quote unquote, from God. It could be a legitimate thing, right? But it's not enough to ground the belief in the religion on. And if your faith never progresses beyond that kind of immaturity level, it's probably not going to last. You're probably going to move on to something else, right? Because what you're motivated by is the emotions. And what does Jeremiah say? The heart is deceptive, right? And wicked. The heart can deceive us. That's why we can't trust in our emotional roller coaster states. And he's correct to respond to Jordan that that's just not a good reason to believe in the religion, right? Maybe the mystical experience was valid. Maybe it wasn't. But that's not a good way or basis to believe in the. That's why you can't ground the religion or your belief in the religion on that kind of stuff. Remember yesterday, right? What did Veganica say in, within 10 minutes of that discussion? She has had a personal, direct experience that Jesus beams his teachings into her mind, and it's not what's in the Bible. Okay, what did we just say? Deuteronomy 13, Deuteronomy 18, Galatians 1. We know to toss that out as delusion, right? That's not from Jesus. That's another kind of spirit, something bad spirit or her own delusion coming from herself, right? What does Jeremiah say? The prophets prophesy not of God, but out of their own mind and heart, right? Critiquing the false prophets. And so in the same way, we have the guide of public revealed dogma, public revelation, Bible, teachings of the councils, church fathers, lives of the saints, liturgy. That's the public domain of revelation. And by the way, revelation ceased. There are no new revelations. Once the apostles died, the apostolic revelation was complete and done. Period. No more public revelations at all. All right. Revelation has ceased. The canon was done and closed in the period of the church fathers, right? I mean, technically speaking, it's always the period of the church fathers, but you know what I mean, right? The first several centuries of the church closed the canon of Scripture. There's no more Bibles being written. There's no new books. There's no new revelations. No Fatimas. None of that. Right? Now, a saint can have clairvoyant experience or this kind of stuff. But that's not what we go by. We go by the publicly confirmed, revealed dogma. Bible, councils, right? Those are the landmarks, right? What does Proverbs say? Do not remove the landmarks that your forefathers and the ancients established. Those are our landmarks. And so anyway, that is an important point to make, that when we don't have those landmarks, we're just awash in a sea, right? What is Jude says about false prophets, that they are just tossed and turned like the sea, moving on from this doctrine to that doctrine, right? Unstable individuals.
Any way to demonstrate a causal connection between a Holy Spirit and my experience. It was, I had an experience, and I, like everyone else around me, attributed it to the Holy Spirit.
What was the experience like?
Elation, euphoria. I don't think I ever had visions, but...
Isn't it interesting, too, that like a lot of the atheists use the same emotional appeal? I am euphoric right now in this moment because of my atheism and my rationalism, right? So I'm glad that Matt realizes this about his own track in terms of the inadequacies of evangelical emotionalism. But, you know, just as a side note, I would like to point out that many atheists fall in... Now, Matt's not doing it here, but many atheists do fall into the trap of the emotional appeal themselves.
Certainly, it was an overwhelming sensation. You know, you get the goosebumps or hair on your head. And it was, and I remember fairly distinctly the first time I had a very similar experience outside of church, because it was from listening to secular music that my church would not have allowed. And then I began to look into things, you know, from far more of a psychological perspective of,
I don't know what church Matt went to. I mean, I've never heard of a Southern Baptist church that didn't allow secular music. I mean, maybe his parents were really strict, but I mean, you'd have to be at like a Bill Hybels, you know, like Bob Jones tier Baptist fundamentalist, independent Baptist church, which he says he wasn't going to. So I'm not sure I believe that he wasn't allowed to hear. I've never heard of a Southern Baptist church that told people they couldn't listen to secular music. I mean, that's a bit much, but anyway.
Of what type of impact specific music has on people. Mm-hmm. And you know, a friend of mine, we've had conversations about the cadence of particular preachers. Mm-hmm, because right. A Southern Baptist minister will have a different cadence than a Pentecostal preacher, and they'll have a different cadence.
This is actually true, and I would agree with Matt's psychological analysis of preachers being manipulative, right? Preachers do, especially the Protestant and the evangelical and the holy roller creeps, engage in this kind of neurolinguistic programming and taking you on this emotional high, and it's a bunch of bullshit. So he's correct about this. I'll give you one example. Paul Washer, right? I've talked about Paul Washer for many years and the humorous experiences that I've had with Paul Washer. And one of the ways that I started realizing that I think Paul was a disingenuous figure was that after many years of seeing Paul's sermon, and by the way, I don't know if he's still popular on YouTube, but for a while there, he was getting really popular. His sermons were getting 1 million views, 100,000 views. I don't know. I haven't followed him anymore, but after many, many, many years, not after he had me thrown out of a church one time, but I noticed that with Paul, right? Paul would do, so when I was an idiot evangelical, I would notice that the Pentecostal charismatic preachers would do this, right? Where it's like a performance, right? Jesse Duplantis and all these creeps, right? They're doing like a stage show, right? And it's an emotional kind of entertainment thing. It's all entertainment and taking you on this highs and lows and telling you weird, crazy stories. Ha ha ha. And then I noticed that, you know what? The Hellfire, Brimstone, Baptists, and Calvinists do the same thing. And I really noticed that Paul Washer was full of it when he would appeal to the Spirit moving him to cry at the same point in every sermon that he gives, the same Hellfire, Brimstone sermon story that he tells. Yeah, come on, dude. I'm supposed to believe that the Holy Spirit moves you every Wednesday night when you tell this same story. I'm sorry, I don't believe it, Paul. Right? I mean, if you go listen to Paul Washer and you'll see what I mean, right? I'm going to talk to you today about Jesus. Friends, Jesus is angry at you. Friends, Jesus hates you right now. And I'm not going to talk to you about grace and kindness and all the things that Joel Osteen wants to talk to you about today, friends. By the way, that's a pretty good approximation of Paul Washer, by the way. But I'm sorry, Paul, the Spirit of God is not moving you to weep every time you do your shtick. I just don't believe it. It's bullshit. And I'm going to call you out as a bullshit artist. I mean, if you hadn't been doing this same shtick for 20 years, dude. But again, why am I mad at the evangelicals and these kinds of clowns? Because they're atheism factories. Yes, Paul Washer is an atheism factory. And that might sound outlandish given the fact that hasn't Paul Washer converted so many people to Calvinism? It's theatrics, dude. And theatrics, emotionalism, it's all shifting sands. If you build your perspective and your paradigm, your worldview on that stuff, you'll be an atheist in 5 or 10 years. Maybe more, maybe sooner, maybe 1 year, right? I mean, these people just churn out atheists because it's not real. Maybe there was a time period when Paul was authentic. I don't know. I'm not interested in judging or going into Paul Washer's psyche and trying to figure out, was he a sincere missionary? I don't know. But I do recall that, Paul Washer has these stories about, and to me, it sounds like total prelest, right? I mean, it's like he says that when he was young, he was so serious about his Christianity that he would not eat for a week or two, and he would go live in his closet and pray for a week or two with no food. And it's like, dude, come on. I mean, we appreciate the ascetic ideal, right, that you're going for, perhaps from the Orthodox perspective. But what did this produce? It produced a guy who comes out of this, thinks he's restoring true Christianity, literally, because the church went into a blackout phase after the death of the apostles. Okay, last time I talked to Paul Washer, that was the quack level BS that he believed. Okay, that's delusion. That is like greatest level classic prelest, right? It's like he's a prophet, right? And no wonder so many people end up atheists when the religious world is full of people like that, full of just deluded people. Cult leaders, right? Now, how do we know when somebody's not a cult leader? Well, one thing that they're going to do is not appeal to their own authority. They're not going to appeal to and point to themselves. You say, well, wait a minute, Jay, are you a cult leader? Maybe you're guilty of all this stuff. What do we tell you to do? Do we tell you to do what I say? No. We direct you elsewhere. We direct away. What does Jesus say? He that seeks his own glory seeks himself. But the Son points you to the Father, right? Jesus set the example that he doesn't call attention to himself in the sense of who to listen to. Who do we tell you to listen to? We say go to the canonical Orthodox Church. You need to find a spiritual father. You need to find a person that will be able to direct you and lead you. That is not my role. I am not a guru. I do not give you spiritual advice in the sense of what you need to do in your personal life. And that's not me. That's not my role. My job is to just simply tell you, like a signpost, a pointer, look to orthodoxy. Look to the church fathers. Look to the Orthodox theologians of the 20th century, Meyendorff, Stein, Florovsky. Look to Athanasius. Look to St. Maximus. Look to the Seventh Ecumenical Council for worship. Look to those things, right? We don't do anything new here. We just repeat what those people say. So no, we're not a cult. Right? We're not trying to direct you to my strip mall church that I built down the road. I don't have a church in the sense of I don't run any church. I don't run any denomination. Right? When you come into the Discord, who do we defer to? The clerics and the priests in the Discord. There you go. That's a key way to know that you're not being led by a cult leader. What does a cult leader do? He says, listen to me. God anointed me. I'm an anointed one. I'm the restoration of the true church, which fell away in the death of the apostles, which fell away in the 4th century, which fell away in the 15th century. It fell away in the 3rd century. I'm going to restore the church. Every cult leader says the same baloney. And by the way, remember in Jesus' ministry, they're constantly asking him, where do you get your authority? Who gave you the authority? John the Baptist, where do you get your authority? Who are you? It's a question of authority. And that's a valid question. Because the authority has to be consistent, it has to come from on high, and it has to come through a consistent lineage, right? You're not going to have a prophet come who teaches something completely different than Moses. And that's Jesus' argument to the Pharisees throughout the book of John. You're not going to have a prophet come who restores the church, right? Zillions of cults say this. Because the church didn't die. The gates of hell can't prevail against the church. So you can't restore what was never fallen. Does God raise up saints like Athanasius to save the church from destruction? Sure. But the church didn't black out. Okay? There was no period of no church, right? And that's one easy way to detect true and false teachings, true and false leaders, cult leaders, etc. is, do they think that the church died? Do they think the succession of bishops died? Right? Do they teach differently than the church taught for the first 1,000 years? Those are easy signposts, public normative ways to determine the difference. All right, let's get back. I'm sorry, we went way down this road here. Let's get back.
And somebody else, and I won't put on a performance to do them, but we have this intense curiosity as to are the successful preachers with those cadence in conjunction with the music? Are they just tapping into some sort of psychological impact in our brain in order to make us pliable? In the same way that the elevator experiment, where you have everybody face the back of the elevator, somebody walks in and they face the doors, and after a while, a lot of them become uncomfortable and turn around and face the back with everybody else for no reason. It's just compliance.
Well, you don't want those backward facers to attack you, you know.
It would be good. But if we're back to back, I think, anyway.
Okay, so let me ask you a question about that. Okay, because I think this gets to the heart of some of these issues. So let's say that we can agree that throughout history and before, people were experiencing a set of transcendent emotions that can be evoked by music and dance and other forms of ritual and in a variety of other ways. But there's also a profound proclivity on the part of people, for one reason or another, to attribute those to some sort of supernatural agency.
Yes.
Now, okay, so I want to separate that from another line of thinking. Okay, so let's just leave that aside. So we can think of that as a theory about the origin of religious belief. The experience comes first. It comes along with an implicit hypothesis about supernatural actors behind the scenes eliciting these experiences. Okay, that's in marked distinction to other theories of religious derivation, like Freud's theory, for example, that religion is a defense against death anxiety, or Marx's theory that religion is the opiate of the masses. Right? It's a much more biological theory, the one we're putting forward.
Sure.
Okay, and it seems to me to be a much more credible theory, even though religious movements can be harnessed for economic purposes and for purposes of manipulation and all of that, obviously.
Yeah,
so,
I would think that there's any number of explanations I've heard for the origins of religion, and I find almost all of them plausible in different forms, except for the one that asserts that they come directly from a supernatural being.
Well, that's interesting, Matt, because that would seems to suggest a kind of confirmation bias, right? So Matt is in an indirect way, or maybe in a direct way, kind of admitting his presuppositions, right? I will hear any explanation except the possibility that Christianity is true. Exactly. And so people interpret the evidence in accord with their paradigm. So that was a key honest admission there on the part of Matt of his presuppositions and biases, which I thought we were neutral, scientific, rational people. We're not supposed to have biases, and I thought so. The evidence is going to be interpreted according to what Matt prefers. That's a key little admission there.
Well, okay, so that's the one we're gonna pursue, though, because
that was funnier than I thought it was. I was just being honest.
Yeah, well, honesty is often funnier.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for that honesty. Right, that's the exact type of thing that we point out as a presuppositionalist, and that human autonomy wants anything to be true except that God exists.
And people think it is.
Boy, don't I know.
So people can have these experiences, and they can be evoked in a variety of ways, and people often find them very valuable, at least in terms of their subjective report.
I agree.
And the psilocybin experiments and also the large-scale analysis of psychedelic drug users, by the way, also indicate that the use of such substances is generally associated with an increment in health rather than a decrement, which is quite interesting, right? It's not something you'd necessarily expect. So here's a question. Why in the world do the people who have these experiences have the proclivity to attribute them to supernatural sources, like to a divine source? Like, what's going on there? Why is that the case?
So best guess, and this is contrary. So
this is the most ludicrous line of debate. Again, I mean, this is proving nothing, going nowhere. Is this just an advertisement for people to trip acid? Or, I mean, like, is Jordan just wanting people to like have a mystical experience because they're more inclined to go down the route of believing in God if they do that? I mean, it's just, this is the worst part of the debate.
Skepticism isn't about, hey, let's debunk this and come up with, but if we were going to go through.
Matt, why do you keep saying this? Skepticism is about debunking things, right? You live to debunk, right? You think that you're an intellectual when you debunk, right? Don't give me this BS that you're not interested in debunking.
Through potential plausible explanation.
There are memes about you being a debunker.
To me, this is very similar to in the 40s and 50s when people were supposedly abducted by aliens or ran into aliens. They had descriptions of aliens that pretty much were varied and often matched the various monsters that you saw in the movies then. After 2001, or after Close Encounters of the Third Kind, almost all descriptions of aliens became the almond-headed, this. Mm-hmm. The narrative in the culture about what an alien was converged. Yeah. And people were, this is what I experienced. In the same way that people will, sometimes cameras will catch.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think Matt's kind of right in what he's saying there, that there is a symbiotic feedback loop between the way pop culture will inject new kind of elements to the alien mythos. But the ways that people have described aliens are fairly consistent, going back to the way people described seeing the elves, right? Whether it's on morphine and you see these entities, or whether it's the hallucinogens and seeing the gods. There's fairly consistent presentations of, the gods and the demons and the aliens. I'm not sure what Matt's trying to prove here, except that he thinks that just there's a cultural explanation for mystical experiences. And since alien stuff is BS, then Jordan's argument doesn't prove anything, which it doesn't. But that doesn't mean, by the way, that all the alien stuff is BS, right? I mean, again, there is the attempt by both of these parties in this debate to try to have a reductionistic type of explanation for things. And I'll give Jordan a little bit of credit because he, at least at the beginning of the debate, wanted there to not be a reductionism in terms of how we know and explain different types of things. But he's gone down this road of it all being a mystical experience and metaphysical substrate. He's never explained or defined or what is the metaphysical substrate, Jordan? What do you mean by that, right? That's his line, his bridge to the transcendent and to God. And I can understand that he wants to do that in the debate, to have a bridge, right? Maybe if I'm debating, I want to use metaphysics, I want to use abstract concepts, I want to use transcendental categories as a bridge, right? Math, numbers, right? I can understand picking something, but what are you talking about? I don't know what you mean by a metaphysical substrate. It's just, it's vague, it's ambiguous. And this is, I think, one of the big criticisms of Jordan by most people is that there's a lot of vagary going on here. And I'm not being unfair because sometimes you have to be vague because we're talking about things that aren't clear. And mystical experiences, yeah, they're not clear. But if your argument is for metaphysical substrate, I want to know what that is. Do you mean the subconscious? Do you mean Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli? Do you mean the anima mundi? Do you mean collective unconscious? Like, what is metaphysical substrate? It's a very vague thing. I don't know what you're talking about.
Orbs or a particular lighting effect in a house that is supposedly haunted will be perceived as a ghost, as a spiritual, humanoid form. When we, in some cases, can show that that's actually not the case.
Yeah, so Matt's talking about confirmation bias. By the way, Matt, do you not think that skepticism is susceptible to confirmation bias? If not, then how come the pathological skeptics are almost always engaging in confirmation bias and denying any questioning of official mainstream stories?
In other cases, we have no idea what they necessarily saw. But because what people understand about spirits and souls and ghosts is in like the zeitgeist of how we think, it enters the consciousness as a plausible explanation, even if ultimately there's no such thing as ghosts.
Yeah, but that explains.
Right, but so Matt's response is correct that a lot of times people have confirmation bias and they will, if you look at the Randonautica app, right, that joke video that we did where we were pointing out how, it could be the case that you're just seeing these events as meaningful when in fact they may just be coincidences. However, to expand this to an entire worldview or paradigm, the skeptical worldview, is self-refuting because you can't actually be skeptical about fundamental presuppositions, categories, and foundations, right? If I believe in the external world, can I really be skeptical about that? Well, maybe as a thought experiment you can, but if you want to have a meaningful, coherent argument, you can't be. Can I be skeptical about the laws of logic? Again, maybe as a thought experiment you can, but not really, right? So you have to believe in those things. And if you have to believe in things that are immaterial, conceptual, invariant, and non-empirical, how do you explain them? How do you justify them? Remember, that's Matt's own argument. Matt is the one who says constantly, don't believe in anything unless you have good, solid, empirical evidence to believe in it. Matt, what is the solid, empirical evidence to believe in that proposition right there itself? Right? That I should only believe in what has solid empirical evidence. What is the solid empirical evidence to believe in that? There isn't one. Thank you.
Explains why they converge, but it doesn't explain why the initial impetus is the attribution of the experiences to something supernatural. Like to something. See, I'm fair enough.
I'm sure that
this has nothing to do with God. Like, what are they talking about? They're going down this rabbit hole of talking about the cause behind the mystical LSD experience. What does this have to do with the truthfulness of God's existence or not?
I'm not convinced that necessarily the natural instinct is to apply it to something supernatural. I think it may be more the case that not only are we pattern recognition machines, but we're the descendants of people who, how you see faces and everything.
Yeah, that's a good hypothesis. That's
And so you see faces or you anticipate that there's something in the book.
Right, so attributing meaning to coincidences doesn't explain the totality of reality, right? Because if everything is coincidence and chaos, then your worldview is coincidence and chaos, and you don't actually have a worldview, right? You see, we always bring this up in the debates, and this is Matt's mistaking something that is true sometimes for a grand narrative worldview approach, because Matt, in our debate, as you saw, wanted to be the consistent skeptic. And my whole argument was that you're not really a skeptic. You're not a consistent skeptic, because if you were, you would follow David Hume, and you don't.
The bush out to get you, and when you go and actually investigate and you find there's nothing in the bush out to get you, rather than assuming that you might have been mistaken, Maybe it's a spirit.
Yeah, the social psychologists call that the hyperactive agency detector.
And the fact that we can be, before we had a good understanding, we still don't have a good understanding of death and the mind and stuff. But if I'm standing here...
Does Matt actually think that we have a good understanding of death and the mind? What is he talking about? I mean, one of the hottest topics of debate is consciousness, and how materialist reductionist philosophers can't explain and don't know what consciousness is. It's a problem, and they try, and guess what? It's because of their stupid materialist presuppositions that they can't explain consciousness, obviously. Now, questioning that would mean questioning faith in scientism. Now, wait a minute. I thought that, right, what is Matt kind of saying here is that we will eventually have an answer. Don't worry, bro. We'll eventually solve these issues. Remember in the Bertrand Russell video that we watched with Tristan the other day, right? Didn't Bertrand Russell say something like this?
I am convinced that certainly down the road we will have an answer through science for all of our problems.
That's called faith. That's a faith-based worldview. You are deceiving yourself, right? You think that you live in a world of science, facts, and logic. And then when you are presented with problems, inadequacies, contradictions, incoherencies, areas that are unclear, unknown, you give a faith-based answer that one day the halls of science and the lab coat men, the science men, the science girls will solve this problem. That's called faith. That's a faith-based worldview.
Here talking to you, and I drop over dead. There's a clear, undeniable difference in me sitting here as an animated being and me laying there as no longer there. And so it seems a natural inference that something that about me has left. That doesn't mean that there's actually something about me, like a soul or whatever, that's left.
Okay, so thank you, Matt, for admitting that he has no soul. He has no consciousness. There's nothing really that left when he went from a living state to a dead state. And that would mean that ultimately, Matt, you are not a self that is making coherent arguments. And so if you're not a self, you're not a being making coherent arguments, because there's no metaphysics, there's none of that stuff, then you're incoherent. You're admitting that you don't make an argument, that you are not a you. But doesn't Matt Dillahunty want to be paid when he goes on tour? Doesn't he want to be paid if he writes a book, right? This is the same point we made to JF. You don't actually live that way. You say that, right, out of your rhetoric and presentation. But I'm pretty sure that Matt wants to get paid for Matt's work. And so you live and act as if metaphysics is true, and you are a self, but you want to go out and convince everybody that there are no selves. Exactly. But now, I guess in this worldview, we don't have to be consistent, right? There's no logical laws. Nothing's actually coherent. So there's nothing wrong with being hypocritical and inconsistent, right? But wait a minute, Matt. I thought we were supposed to obey the laws of logic and consistency. You are trying to call Jordan out and all the theists out, right, for not being consistent. But what is binding us, logically speaking, to actually be consistent? You don't live consistently. You just denied the self, and yet you want to be paid for your speaking tour because you're Matt Dillahunty, a self, right, that has a right to get paid for what he does. You see the games these people play? They're playing games.
We don't tend to think the same thing when the radio stops working or the television stops working. It's not like the man in the TV has left. It's just off.
Let me see a false analogy, right? So the fact that a radio or a TV turns off is no different than a human being dying, right? Totally false analogy because it's based on the presupposition of materialism. Now, Matt has not proven skepticism or empiricism or materialism or reductionism in this debate, right? At no point has he really even offered a counter argument or proof. He's just tried to play the skeptic, right? Like he's going to sit back as this agnostic skeptic who doesn't know anything. I don't know. I don't know that there's any proof of anything. We can't say, it's you arrogant theists who claim to know. I don't know. But this is a mirage. This is a ruse because Matt actually is claiming to know things, making metaphysical claims that he doesn't even realize are exceptionally strong claims.
But it seems that those sorts of natural...
I don't know if you want to use that analogy because it suggests that whatever's in the TV is coming from an external source. And you're definitely not making that argument with regards to the soul.
Well, the TV station isn't in my living room, so there's at least some external source sending it to there.
Right, but that's exactly my point.
Yeah, that's all I was going for.
You make a case that consciousness isn't...
That was actually, it wasn't a great argument, but that actually was a decent point that Jordan made back to him that, Matt, that's a dumb analogy. Are you sure you want to make that analogy?
Exactly in your head either, even though it's localized there.
So why would I think consciousness is anywhere other than my head?
Well, how do you account for consciousness?
Well, I'm not sure that we can account for consciousness.
This is definitely true.
But
yes. See, and that's
I have
another
no reason to think that it's beyond what the brain produces.
Exactly, right. So the brain produces consciousness. It's essentially identical to the brain. The mind is the brain. The self is the brain, is the gray matter. And so there is no self. Does Matt really believe that he's not a self? Matt seems to think of himself quite highly. It's odd that he would think so highly of something that doesn't exist.
The fact that something's mysterious doesn't mean that, well, if something's mysterious...
Consciousness isn't just mysterious. It's like really mysterious. It's the most mysterious thing.
Okay, well,
right? It's not like ordinary mysterious.
The fact that something is really mysterious to the point where I think you and I would agree that we don't have an explanation for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if there was something like that, we'll say that it's maybe consciousness. We agree we don't have an explanation, or at least a complete one for consciousness?
Or even a partial one.
Okay, sure.
So, it seems vaguely associated with the brain.
So consciousness is really mysterious, and you and I have no explanation for it. As human beings, we're uncomfortable with saying, I don't know. This is something I'm trying to teach people to become more comfortable with.
Oh, is that right, Matt? Really? Because the whole skeptical project that appears under the smoke and mirrors of agnosticism and humility, as we saw from our debate, is actually a dogmatic perspective of rigid what can and cannot be and duplicity, right? Because Matt says, don't believe in anything that you can't empirically ground or justify. I asked Matt 3 or 4 basic questions about things that he believes in that are non-empirical, and he could not justify or give an account for them. And in response, he says, it just is. I don't have to give an account for it. It just is. How many times did he say in the debate, it just is? Do you understand that in a debate, that is losing? That is a completely baseless, ad hoc loss. The very thing that you're grounding your position on, you're saying just is. Now, as an opponent in the debate, I can reply by saying, well, God just is. If you can be ad hoc, I can be ad hoc. I'm not making that argument. I'm not saying God just is. I'm illustrating the point. Okay, all the idiot atheists in that debate thought I was saying that God just is. I'm illustrating that you can't make an ad hoc argument, dude. These people are like, atheism is a mental illness. It's like a mental illness. It really is. I mean, they think that theism is a mental illness. No. You guys are the mental ill people because you do the very thing that out of your mouth you say you can't do within like a minute. Don't believe in anything that you can't empirically verify. Matt, can you empirically verify logic? Of course not. Logic is not empirical. Well, thank you. Why do you believe in logic? Because it just is, Jay. Who is dumb enough to believe that that was a good argument and that that was a sufficient reply to my challenge in the debate? I mean, if you believe that, I have no help for you. There's nothing I can say. Like that's should be on the face of it obvious.
Is to say, I don't know. And so when you ask me about...
This is a ruse. They're not saying I don't know. They're not actually being skeptical, right? Because when I ask them about the things that they use to critique the theists, they're not skeptics about it. They're dogmatists.
Consciousness, my answer is, I don't know. But for other people, They're so uncomfortable.
No, it's not, Matt. That is totally disingenuous. You do not always say, I don't know.
With I don't know, that they posit an explanation that they cannot justify, something is untestable and unfalsifiable, and that...
You mean the things that I asked you in the debate that are untestable, unfalsifiable, that you can't justify, like the laws of logic, like transcendental categories? All of those things that you said I can't justify, I can't give an account for, they just are. They just are. They just are. You said that 5, 10 times in the debate. That's why you lost the debate. They just are. You said no transcendental category or object can be proven because you thought that a presupposition is just something you can't prove. That's not what a presupposition is.
And that is that there's a ghost in the machine. I can't make that leap because it is entirely speculation without support.
Matt, everything that you acknowledged to believe in is therefore speculation without support on your own grounds.
Seems intuitively right because of how we view the world. And yet, I would rather say, I don't know, and then continue to explore.
But that's not what you did, right? You spent the debate saying no one can know, and therefore God doesn't exist. And logic, I do believe in, it just is, you see. So totally contradictory, totally inconsistent. They're not honest with themselves. But by the way, if you're an atheist, you don't have to be honest, right? You can lie.
For it, because I worry that by asserting what the explanation is, you stop looking for the actual explanation.
Okay, so you made the case that...
Yeah, but remember, Matt said that the actual explanation should be anything but theism. So Matt isn't actually neutral, right? And he admitted that, if you listened.
Part of the reason that we assume beings is because there's a being that seems lacking in death. And that was associated... I had asked the question about why people attribute their mystical experiences to supernatural beings. So we kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but it was related. So we could say, well, your idea is something like people personify the soul for obvious reasons, and they also have a hyperactive agency detector. And so it's the combination of whatever mechanisms that produce that allow them to attribute supernatural personification to the source of mystical experiences. It's something like that. Yeah, okay. So let me ask you something. We'll get back to that, maybe.
That's fine.
Let me ask you something about consciousness. You tell me what you think about this, okay? All right, so this is how it looks to me. I mean, there's lots of ways of thinking about how people interact with the world. But I think this is how we treat ourselves and other people as we see them acting in the world. And so I would say it's indicative of our deepest belief, because I think belief is associated with action. So the way consciousness appears to me is that it's a faculty, let's say, that confronts possibility. We'd call that possibility, well, sometimes possibility, sometimes we call it potential, like your potential. Sometimes we call it the future. So I don't see us as driven deterministically like clocks, which is apparently, I think, although I've been...
He's using maybe some odd verbiage, but this is basically making the point that we're conscious agents, right? We are an agent that is, through potentia, choosing different things, right? Free will. So I think that's what Jordan's getting at here, which I think he's correct to say that if you believe yourself to be a being that makes choices, then that presupposes free will, right? So if Matt wants to say that no, he's a Sam Harris level determinist, that's going to lead him into the determinist fallacy.
Accused of misunderstanding Sam Harris before, but I think that's the argument that he makes. I see us instead as agents confronting a landscape of possibility, and that what consciousness does is enable us to shape that possibility into actuality. And we do that with whatever it is that allows us to make decisions. I think that our legal system is basically predicated on the idea that that's true. I think that if you treat yourself that way, that works.
Yeah, and this is what, again, is a roundabout way of saying the point that I was making earlier, which is that all of these atheists want to hold people accountable, right, if their wallet gets stolen, right? If their Bitcoin gets stolen, right? They just, I demand my Bitcoin come back. It's not fair, right? It's not fair. They want the money in the check when they write a book, right? They have the right to this is all nonsense in their worldview, but they don't live according to what they actually say. And this is actually a good point. I think that Jordan is finally kind of hitting on an actual argument, finally.
I think if you treat other people as if that's their basic characteristic and perhaps their value, that you get along with them. And I think that if you organize your society on that presupposition, it appears to be functional. So what do you think about the idea of consciousness as confronting a landscape of possibility or potential? Is there something?
So I don't know that I have that much of an issue with anything in particular that you've said. There's a number of different ways to frame these things.
Yeah, so people are taking issue with the language. I mean, landscape of possibility, I don't think that there's a problem with that. I mean, we believe that individuals really do have the ability to choose different options, right? They're not determined in a strict sense. And so there is the reality to free will, right? So I don't see why there would be problems with that language. I mean, maybe he has some weird view about free will that I don't know. I'm not a devotee of Jordan Peterson, but I just think he's trying to express in language that's, familiar maybe to Matt, the possibility of freedom.
So that people can have a better grasp on it. One of the things I know people struggle with is, and we may have to get back to this in a minute, I don't necessarily want to dig in on it just a second, but I would love to talk about it. This idea that absent a God, there's no moral authority. This is a fear that many people have. And when you're talking about
Matt, exactly.
Viewing consciousness as the way you describe consciousness is what I would probably call our agency.
Okay.
And while I don't think that we have libertarian free will, I'm on record as being a compatibilist along with Dan Dennett. But I also had another discussion recently, so I'm going to clarify it because of that discussion. I'm fine with the idea that we have a will, that we have desire.
I like how Matt believes that it's important that we know what his theory is. Like the world is waiting to see, like, does Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Matt Dillahunty have a clear statement? What's your statement? Right? We're all waiting to hear the statement on what Matt, with almost no philosophical training, believes about free will.
That we are an agent that is also capable of self-reflection to see what are the consequences of my action moving forward. To me, it does not matter if that is ultimately deterministic, like clockwork, or if there was something that could trump determinism. Oh, I shouldn't have said Trump. I'm so sorry. If there was something that could actually overcome the deterministic view, that doesn't change to me the fact that you would be the agent responsible for your actions.
Yeah, it would, Matt. I mean, it would, okay? There would not be an agent. And in fact, about 5 minutes ago, you said that there's not really consciousness. So now there is. Basic fundamental contradiction. I don't remember because I haven't listened to this debate in a year. I hope Jordan calls him out on that because what was the exact phrase? Maybe you guys will remember. There is no consciousness. I don't believe in consciousness. There's not a basis to believe in consciousness. And now Matt is telling us that there is an agent that's compatible. No, sorry, Matt, you just contradicted big time.
Now, when my lawnmower acts up, I will sometimes anthropomorphically, cuss it out.
Yeah, it's hard to get rid of those vestiges of religious behavior.
But yeah,
that's true.
It is
exactly, Matt. That's a good
Touché.
point. That was a good point. That was a decent. Now I don't know. I don't recall if Jordan will follow through with this, but that was a subtle, good call out there. That really, why are you anthropomorphizing all of these things that really have no intellectual, rational basis, right? At all. I mean, the self has no basis in this worldview.
Although at least I got rid of them.
I haven't seen you interact with your lawnmower yet.
No, he hasn't. Matt has just displayed that he has not gotten rid of the anthropomorphic metaphysical assumptions that he claims to be rid of.
But at the end, I recognize that the lawnmower is not a thinking agent that is not making decisions.
Yeah, but you just said that the self, the mind, is also not conscious We don't know what it is. There's not reason to believe that it's a metaphysical thing. And then you said you're an agent. You just got caught, brah.
And so that difference between there.
And by the way, agent is a metaphysical, ontological type of thing. We're back in the domain of metaphysics. Remember, skeptics can't do metaphysics. Skepticism is predicated on the Humean tradition. It begins with David Hume, who says, throw out metaphysics. It's worthless. We don't do that anymore. But Matt, knowing little to no philosophy at all, doesn't even know that he's constantly mouthing metaphysical positions, claims, right? Strong metaphysical beliefs, totally clueless.
Is where I would inject the sort of ideas about moral responsibility. Sam Harris and I had.
Here we go. Moral responsibility itself in the domain of ethics and metaphysics, in the domain of epistemology. There's no consciousness, but this non-conscious bit of stew, this bit of brain matter, this bit of monkey goo, has a moral responsibility.
Argument in Chicago about free will, and I was pointing out that he could walk over and step off the end of the stage, or I could pick him up and carry him and drop him off the stage, and at the end the effect would essentially be the same. But the conflict between those two is everything that I describe as will, whether you want to call it free or not. I think that's what we value. That's what we care about. I would be responsible for that action. I would be.
It's interesting that Matt is caught in a dilemma here, right? He doesn't want to deny free will because he sees the problems where it leads, but he also doesn't want to affirm it because it leads in the direction of metaphysical claims, which he's committed himself to basically excluding. But this is the dilemma, right? At a fundamental level, you are caught between ultimate irrationality and meaninglessness, and at the same time wanting a wholly rational and coherent and meaningful experience and world. You can't have it both ways.
Acting in opposition to what the other agent wanted. And I don't know that you have to...
And there would be something hypothetically wrong about that.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, Matt, there's nothing wrong in your worldview. That doesn't exist. There's no metaphysical value judgments, objective benchmark categories like wrong. This is a fundamentally stupid argument on his part. I hope Jordan calls him out on this.
Good. So that's close.
We can get to the morality thing because I think the next question
I hope so, because you're going to implode there.
On that is a lot of, like I was saying earlier, it seems that you're talking a lot about you haven't addressed the issue, and I'm not going to push back on it because I want to move on to some other stuff.
I'm getting there.
Of whether or not there is good reason to believe there actually is a God, as opposed to whether there are good reasons for people to believe that there actually is a God. Dan Dennett describes, there are people who believe, and then there are people who believe in belief, that there's value. And
this is a bunch of word salad, right? Believe or believing in believing, right? So he's trying to sound sophisticated and like take things to a meta level, and it's really nothing. He's saying nothing here.
From what you said here and in some other comments, which I'm not going to saddle you with, I'm curious. Irrespective of whether there's a God, what is it that you fear we would lose if people stopped believing that there was a God or believing there was value in believing?
We'd lose the metaphoric substrate of our ethos, and we'd be lost.
And
What? So Jordan, he could have just demolished Matt at this point, and by calling out the stuff that I just called out. And what does Jordan do? He says we'll lose the metaphysical substrate of our ethos. Now, I think he intends to say something along the lines of what I would say, and this is where the debate almost gets to a transcendental argument. I think best charitable interpretation is that he's trying to say the kind of argument I would make. It's bumfuddled and fuzzy and unclear given the verbiage that Jordan prefers, but I think that's what he's trying to say. But he's really going to drop the ball here because there are multiple places where he could just kind of like just twist Matt into a pretzel and make him look like a know-nothing.
And so I'm
I think Nietzsche
an
was right about
uneducated.
that.
So I really want to know, and I'm not being a dick. I want to know what you mean by metaphorical substrate, because saying we're going to lose it. So there's the idea. When I ask, what do you think we're going to lose? There's two things. One is there's something that you and I would both agree.
By the way, this is also not really a relevant question to the actual debate, right? This is maybe a pragmatic concern, or Matt's asking basically, look, what are you scared of if we give up the belief in God, right? That we won't have morals? This is where Matt's going with it. Again, this is all within the domain of utility, pragmatism and utility, right? Because really, that's all that anybody who adopts these kinds of worldviews has left. Whether you're in the Matt side of the liberal dialectic or Jordan's side of the liberal dialectic, right? They're both couched within modern liberalism. And so for them, man is the center of the universe for both of their worldviews. And so all they can try to do is debate which paradigms are more useful or utilitarian to the individual man. Guess what? That has nothing to do with what's true or false. Okay. And what you determine to be utilitarian and useful is already determined by your presuppositions. If I'm believing in myself as the Kwisatz Haderach, I'm the universe's super being, I'm the God man of the universe, then for me, it's useful perhaps to destroy everyone and keep my harem of wives and repopulate the earth. So for me, mass depop is useful. That's the most utilitarian thing in my worldview, perhaps. You see how what is useful is not a brute fact. There's no neutrality in terms of what's useful. What I determine to be useful will be conditioned and determined by my governing presuppositions. Obviously, duh. There's no self-evident idea of what's useful. One group of people thinks that killing off most of the planet is useful. Another group of people thinks, as a Christian, that we should not kill off most of the planet. And so Christianity is the most useful to a person. You see what it's just, this is so obvious. It should be obvious. It shouldn't even be that hard to figure out that what you think is useful is going to be determined by your value system and your paradigm as a whole. But this whole debate has really been stuck in irrelevant, pointless questions that don't prove or disprove anything, except to illustrate the futility of having debates within liberal paradigms. Again, two liberals debating things from the time of classical liberalism on up that go nowhere, right? Two dogs chasing each other's tails.
Try to keep.
Yeah.
And there are other things that you and I might disagree on whether or not we should keep it. Because when people say to me, oh, if we go down the road with Dostoevsky, that, if there is no God, everything's permissible. First of all, I don't think that's remotely true, because I have...
He makes a pretty vicious case for it, beyond good and evil.
And despite the fact that it sounds monumentally arrogant, I think I can demolish that case in about 2 minutes with his secular morality lecture.
Yeah, no, Matt actually I'm glad that Jordan called him out here, because in to give credit where it's due here to Jordan, there really is no reason to prefer anything in an atheist paradigm, right? One outcome preferred over another because of the equality of all actions and outcomes in this worldview, in the reductionistic worldview. The only distinguishing features between any action or event or preferable behavior is purely subjective. It's purely taste. So there is no real preference to the collective good or the individual good or any of that stuff. It's all purely subjective, purely relative. There's no actual reason why one is ought over the other, preferred over the other, right? This didn't I even ask Matt this in the debate? Matt, have you not read David Hume? You can't get an ought from an is. Now, Matt's whole worldview is ises. It just is. He even said in the debate, it just is, right? It's an it just is worldview. Try reading David Hume, Matt, the most famous atheist of the entire Enlightenment period. Try reading David Hume, Matt. Maybe you would learn Philosophy 101. Maybe you would learn that you're not the first person to have those thoughts under the guise of humility and agnosticism. You haven't even read basics. If you had read David Hume, you would know that you can't get an ought from an is. And when I brought that up in the debate, Matt said, I don't care what David Hume says. That's an appeal to authority. I'm not appealing to him as an authority. I'm appealing to his arguments. This is pitiful.
What? Well, I think the first part of that statement is right, but not the second one.
And we could find out. But the thing is, there would be two categories of things that you and others might be fearful we would lose, some of which I might agree we should definitely not lose these things.
Yep.
So all of this is irrelevant, again, to the debate. Okay, none of this has anything to do with the objective, rational, logical argumentation about whether there is a God or not. Okay, this whole debate is usefulness. The whole debate is utility, pragmatism. The debate itself shows the futility and stupidity of the entire Enlightenment liberal tradition. Not in everything, not every single writer, right? Kant has some insights, right? We're not Kantians, but Kant has some interesting insights, some good arguments. Other Enlightenment philosophers have some interesting insights and arguments. But as a whole, as a project, as a system building project, it is completely collapsed. It is fallen apart. It is you can't build systems anymore. And these are two people who seem to be completely ignorant of this. Like they don't even know this. It's like they don't even know what the liberal tradition says and the dead ends of the liberal tradition.
Others I might be absolutely fine with losing.
Like it that it's wrong to throw Sam Harris off a stage.
Yeah. I don't plan on doing that. But
well, we both
did
agreed
cross
that
my mind at one point.
We both agreed that was probably wrong.
Yeah.
Now, right. Why is this wrong? No. Matt will talk all day and give you a zillion circle talking arguments that are non-arguments about why anything is wrong. By the way, you just denied consciousness like 10 minutes ago. Why, like squishing a bug, opening a can of, Bubba Cola and cutting up a baby those actions have no difference. It's just one set of molecules moving into another state. Literally, it's the equalizing of all acts, right? They just are. And Matt's humanistic ethic is complete absurdity. Total, ad hoc, arbitrary nonsense. Who cares, by the way, what you, Matt, as a bunch of bubbling chemicals, thinks is right and wrong? Because there is no right or wrong in bubbling chemicals, bro. Don't you get it?
Yes.
So that's good.
Probably.
Yeah.
See, I'm a situational ethicist, and so there might be situations. If the stage were on fire, throwing Sam off would be the best thing I could do for him.
So here he's admitted that the ethics is purely determined by the situation, right? Situationist ethics is purely relative, purely contingent upon the case in hand, which, by the way, is no kind of ethic, right? Now, I'm not saying that in ethics you can't have an element of situation, right, where you, like in Orthodox, ethics, we apply economia. The bishops apply economia to situations. But that doesn't mean all ethics is situationist, obviously.
So what do you think we're likely to lose? What bothers you? And when you say metaphorical substrate,
finally, Matt has asked a good question here, which is, what are you talking about? What is metaphysical metaphorical substrate. What are you talking about? And yes, by the way, a good comment in the chats. We'll read a couple super chats here in a minute because, we've been going for 3 hours on, we're just now to like the decent point, right, of the metaphysical, almost transcendental argument. But yes, I would actually say to Cerberus's point, I mean, really, JF is the most consistent so far of the atheists that we've debated. JF is a strict determinist and nihilist, and I think that we should give credit that is, in a way, the most consistent of the atheists that we debated. Now, I don't think that he's consistent because in the debate, I think we showed the futility of his argument, but he's a little more consistent than most of these people who are just there. It's more like they will shift, right? Like they'll say this is my position. When they realize they're kind of getting boxed in, then suddenly they'll kind of slide over here into this other position. And that's most of what the atheists do, right? They pretend like they don't have a position. They pretend it's agnostic. And then they're like slipping around and doing all these different fake out moves, right? Juking you out type of moves, right? And it's really just all over the place and not consistent when their whole thing is about being consistent, you see.
Probably just monumentally ignorant, but I really don't think I have a good understanding of what you mean.
Well, there's levels of thought. I mean, every thought structure, let's say, every belief structure is...
I could agree with this. I think this is, if I recall, this is the point where Jordan does have a pretty good argument. And he's really, he still drops the ball, but he's at least kind of like, he's kind of like he could have knocked Matt out if he wanted to, I think, maybe, hopefully, right? But he's just kind of like doing like a slow motion dream punch here.
Multi-leveled, like a piece of music. And there's the word in a phrase, and then there's the phrase, and then there's the sentence, and then there's the paragraph, and then there's the sequence of paragraphs within which the paragraphs are uttered. And then there's a broader context of interpretation within which all of that is interpreted.
This is a good point. I like where Jordan's going here. I mean, he's really kind of like, again, it's almost like he had an open jaw that he could have just like got the KO, right? And it's like he's hitting on Matt's like, upper gunt area. And, he's really sort of lobbing away at that. Matt's getting a little kind of shaky. And there's an open jaw he could have gone for.
And then there's our emotional and motivational similarity. And then there's our embodiment in the world. And all of those things are operative at all times when we're understanding one.
Now, this is true. So he's loosely hitting at a paradigm. He's trying to couch it in this vague kind of psychoanalysis speak. But what he's hitting at is the bigger context of a worldview or a paradigm, right? So he was saying, think about a word situated in a sentence situated in a paragraph, paragraphs are situated in other paragraphs, paragraphs are put together in a book, right? And so he's using some good analogies. Remember my story analogy earlier, a movie? That's what we're talking about here from a paradigm perspective, right? We have to think holistic, whole context here. This is good. This is good.
One another. And as you move outside the realm of the linguistic, like the paragraph level, let's say, into the realm of the emotional and motivational and embodied, you also move into the metaphorical. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the metaphorical is structured in a particular way.
Okay.
And this is quite well documented, by the way. I mean, if you look at how the hemispheres interact. So
I wish Jordan hadn't restricted this to emotional metaphor. I wish he had, kind of broadened these categories. That would have been a little better, I think.
Left hemisphere, broadly speaking, and I'm not oversimplifying this except that we don't have much time, is linguistic. But the linguistic utterances are understood in the context provided more by the right hemisphere, which is nonverbal, and which attends to things like the music of language.
Okay.
And so at the bottom of a linguistic structure, there's something that's extra linguistic, and it tends to take form in metaphor and narrative and drama and that sort of thing. And the religious landscape is the narrative, metaphor, drama landscape. And if you just...
By the way, people are asking about the old debates. Every debate is on my Spreaker feed. So you can go to the podcast feed. If something has been removed from YouTube, which we don't have total control of, you can always find the full debates. Just Google Spreaker, J Dyer JF. Spreaker, J Dyer, whatever. Right? So the audios are always there. They've never gone anywhere. It's not lost. You just have to go to the podcast feed. So a lot of these debates are on other people's channels. I can't, control if those get taken down or whatever.
Disrupt it, then you blow apart the widest possible context within which the specific utterances are rendered comprehensible.
Okay, so I followed all that.
This is a good analogy to linguistic philosophy. I like where he's going. I wish he had really he's setting Matt up for a really good mistake. In other words, Matt could really be trapped here. This was the best move in the debate for Jordan so far. Will he really utilize it though?
Shockingly. Anytime you were talking about science and hemispheres and all this other stuff. So when you're talking about the broader context, if we lose belief in a God, we lose that metaphorical substrate that is the broader context in which we evaluate these narratives.
Yeah, that really grinds them
Spreaker, it's one of the top apps for audio and podcast.
into our bodies. That makes them things we believe rather than just think.
Sure. But
See, you didn't
what
just
is it about
think,
the
you didn't
narratives?
just think that it was wrong to throw Sam off the stage.
God, Sam's going to be pissed when he hears it.
Yeah. Well, that's okay.
Well, so
See, there's a difference between thinking something and believing it, because to believe it, it has to be thought incarnated in some sense. It has to be embodied.
When I talk about it, belief is the state of being convinced that a proposition is true or likely true. It's everything that I try to do, I tend to view in the form of propositional reasoning. So when we talk about the narrative,
Yeah, that's a problem.
He doesn't actually, by the way. So we got into that in the debate, but that's another issue.
By the way.
okay,
Yeah, well, you can't reduce the world to a set of propositions.
why not?
Oh, look,
This is another great point, right? This is Matt is really doesn't even realize it, but he's slipping up here, right? This is where Jordan could knock him out.
Show me something that is
No
true
problem,
in
no.
the world that is not a proposition. That
like an
you cannot
explicit,
put in the
statable proposition.
something that is demonstrably true that I could not put in a proposition.
Oh, that's easy. You
Okay.
sure you want to go there?
I'm not.
Now this is good. See, this Jordan's coming was way behind. Okay, Matt was definitely ahead in this debate by just kind of calling out the bad arguments that Jordan has made, right? And then Jordan is making a big comeback here, setting Matt up for a huge mistake. Matt doesn't even see this coming. He thinks he's going to just kind of agnostically, I don't know my way out of this, which he tried to do with me, but it's not going to work.
Afraid of anything.
Okay. Okay.
If I'm wrong, I want to know I'm wrong. But
That's not actually true, right? Now, Matt it was afraid, actually, in the fact that when we had our debate, he immediately had to get 2 PhDs on to help him out. So it's not actually true that Matt's not afraid of anything and that he wants to be shown that he's wrong, because he has been shown that he's wrong, and just has continued to double down in the fact that logic, abstract entities just are, and they don't have to be justified.
I'm trying to, for years I had this thing going where people would say, oh, and this is kind of what we're getting at from a different angle. I would say they would be afraid of what we would lose if we lost religion. And I basically said, demonstrate to me any benefit.
Oh, you'd lose art and poetry and drama and narrative
Why?
and story.
Are there no godless artists and poets?
Now, Jordan hadn't. Like, he could have pointed out any of the metaphysical claims as the example of the very thing that he's trying to illustrate, and he's not. He's chosen bad examples. Art, literature, those are utilitarian, man. Yes, if Matt's right, we would lose those things. But you had him right here. You could have called him out on Matt using the very things that he says don't exist and can't exist and he doesn't believe in. This is where he drops the ball, I think, going from memory.
There are artists and poets who think they're godless.
So we might have crossed over into a problem area. Because
So there's some Redditor in the background that's just having a debunking orgasm over that question, right? So he thinks that like, right? He thinks that this is over. Like Matt is just devastated, Jordan. He doesn't even see that Jordan actually has the upper hand here. It's just, will he follow through?
No doubt.
I can't draw for crap, although I do draw during the show. But one of the individuals who came to the show the other night handed me something that she had spent a great deal of time.
What Jordan's arguing is that atheists don't actually live out their atheism, and this is a valid point.
Drawing. She's a wonderful artist. I'm very grateful to get it. And, while I pretend to read minds on stage, I constantly acknowledge that I can't actually read minds. So I can't tell you whether or not she actually believes in a God, but I can tell you that I actually don't believe in a God.
It did sound like an ape.
And I could write
But yeah,
poetry.
you do.
That's the irony here is like the atheists that have been cracking up and hooting and hollering from the audience literally have sounded like apes. Right? They're like clapping monkey in the background.
Huh?
But you act like you do. That's why you didn't
I
want to throw
act
poor
like-
Sam off the stage.
No, now you're making a claim. Okay, so I'm telling you I don't believe there's a God. And
Yeah.
your response to that is, I really do, because I have a moral sense. But
Yes, correct, Matt. Yes, you're kind of getting it.
my moral sense is utterly without any appeal to a God.
Yeah, but see, Matt, that's the point, is that you have an appeal to a moral sense. The moral sense has no justification because by your own strictures, it's not something you should believe in. What is the empirical basis for believing in a non-material, non-empirical thing like moral sense? Oh, there's not one. Exactly.
Explicitly.
Or implicitly.
Maybe.
The
That's not so obvious.
Okay, it's really
See,
it's
because
easy.
you regard Sam Harris as an implicitly valuable entity.
Correct. Yes,
'Cause otherwise
Jordan
you
is
just
right
throw him
here.
off the
Right.
stage.
So this is his best moment. This is where he is at least throwing a little bit of a punch. A little bit of more like a slap, right? like a light slap, right? Like more like a light pimp slap, right? But it's not the KO he could have thrown.
And then the question is, well, just exactly why is he an implicitly valuable entity?
Correct.
I don't
What's your
think he's-
metaphysics of that?
I don't
Yes.
think he's implicitly
Thank you. He threw in, what is the metaphysics of this? This was correct. Why is it valuable to not toss Sam Harris off of the stage? This was the best point in the debate, if I recall, from Jordan. Matt kind of senses, I think, that he can't get around this, but he's so used to this objection that he's got a flurry of rhetoric that he uses to deflect.
In the sense, I don't think he's implicitly valuable in the sense that the universe has implied that there's something explicit about it. For me, morality.
See, exactly. So for me, right. So now he's going to filibuster, move the discussion over into the question of his bullshit theory of morality as a secular atheist, right? That's the point where Jordan really had the upper hand. So exactly, right? Because there's no external to humanity outside of humanity's purview of value for any human being, there is no ought. Remember, what does he say? Is. It just 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 is, right? That's Matt's worldview. And as Hume said, famously, you can't get an ought from an is. But Matt wants there to be his, what does he call it? Secular moral theory or whatever he's come up with, right? This bullshit. It has no justification. It's not a thing empirically verifiable. Matt, what is the empirical verification for secular moral theory? There is none. Exactly. Over and over and over, we can hammer this home. Jordan got him right there. But instead of calling him out on that and producing the TKO, Jordan just leaves it as a kind of a light slap and allows Matt to move on to filibuster BS to deflect.
Is far simpler than some people.
Now wait, you
make it
sounded
out to be.
doubtful about that.
Yes, thank you.
You know that, like,
Maybe you're the mind reader.
Maybe.
So now Matt's trying to make jokes to get around the fact that he actually is caught here.
Because you've already suggested that despite me sitting here and having talked about this for decades, that I don't believe in God, that I actually do because I have a moral code. But
Matt is deflecting from what that argument is. He knows that the person who is making this critique is not saying that Matt is consciously acknowledging the existence of God. The argument, obviously, is that you live as if there is a God, even though you confess that there's not. Obviously, that's the argument. But Matt is making this argument into a straw man, right? And saying, like, I'm pretty sure I don't believe in God, and, like, you're saying that I do. I mean, it's like, what? No way, dude. Like, I literally don't believe in God. So, like, your argument saying that I do? Like, bro, I don't, okay? Like, he knows that's not the argument, right? But this is his deflection. This is his little trick, right? His stage magic trick to avoid the challenge and the dilemma.
my moral code, which I've
Well, I was
talked
more
about.
specific. I said it was
Yes.
because you didn't want to throw Sam off
Yes,
the stage.
Jordan.
It
Yes,
wasn't
yes,
just
You
that
didn't.
had a
You
moral
didn't
code.
promote. You didn't even attempt to ask me why I didn't throw Sam off the stage.
Deflection. Famous Matt deflection.
Instead, you went to why do you think Sam has implicit value? Because it
Okay.
seems
Yeah, that's a valid question, Matt. Right? That is a valid question. Why do you think Sam has implicit value in your chaos, flux, cosmic soup worldview? Nothing has value. Value is subjective. And if it's subjective, it's just as meaningless as non-value. There's no value, non-value. It just is. And it also isn't, you see.
So,
that in
okay,
your narrative,
I'm willing
that's
to go
the
there.
only justification.
Well, maybe you were afraid of being punished.
Matt, there's no justification. That's the point. What is the justification at all, Matt?
I think you no.
Oh,
I think
okay.
you can have a perfectly acceptable foundation for secular morality, even if it fundamentally centers around selfishness. I'd rather.
So Ayn Rand here, does he really think that he's going to be able to defend this? Right. So he's going to have a what Rand theory, like game theory, like Rand Corporation approach to like fundamental selfishness. And then we can erect a social construct, utilitarian, what benefits the most. This is what the rational calculus utilitarians tried to do. Let's tally up pleasure points through moral calculus. And we can, I mean, this is so dumb. This is so dumb.
rather not be thrown off the stage. It's in my best interest to encourage that.
Matt doesn't even know what a justification is, right? So this is circular to say it's in my best interest and I wouldn't want to be thrown off a stage, so I probably shouldn't throw other people off a stage. That's not an argument. That is not a justification. That's a subjective appeal. You see, do you see this? This is an easy, basic philosophical point.
Sort of understanding in others. And
by the way, you already said a minute ago, you don't know what a self is, and that consciousness doesn't have any basis for existence. Now we're supposed to, out of some vague idea of common good for selfish purposes, not harm other beings. This is total bullshit.
therefore, I will not throw him off the stage. I would rather not have my stuff stolen, and it's in my best interest to encourage others not to do that, so I will not steal stuff, and I will work with others to ensure that the people who steal stuff are punished.
I mean, if you didn't catch the total arbitrary, subjective appeal incoherence of that argument, I mean, it was like, Matt, like, you just demolished everything that you believed in the first hour of this debate, right? Because now you're saying that there are some kind of norm, some kind of thing that is the case, but you were on a crusade to fight against superstition. And when I ask you what the basis to believe in your norms, your best for all people, there isn't one. It's not empirical, you see. This is ad hoc. But remember, it's okay to be ad hoc, right? Because Matt says you can say something just is.
It is in a virtually pragmatic moral system.
Why do you think it's not in your best interest to have stuff stolen?
This is a good argument. Now, Jordan states it in a retarded way, right? Why do you think it's in your best interest not to have things stolen from you? I mean, flip the argument around and say, why is it not in your best interest to just kill people and take their stuff
from you or to be thrown off the stage?
Why is it not in my best interest?
Yeah. No, you don't get to think, oh, that's self-evident. It's like nothing's self-evident to the skeptic. Let's keep that in mind.
Yes, thank you. Finally a good argument from Jordan. Thank you. This is almost in the transcendental category of what is self-evident. I'm sorry, Matt, there's no thing self-evident in your worldview. Finally, one really good train of argument.
So,
because if we're going to get skeptical...
Now, the audience at first thought that this wasn't a good argument, right? I think it was a bad phrasing. Why is it not in your best interest to be thrown off the stage? It's not the best way to formulate that. But the point still stands that there's nothing self-evident in your paradigm, Matt.
Here, we might as well go all the way to the bottom.
So for Sam and I, the foundations, and we're not the only ones, but I tend to reference Sam just because if I say this, then somebody will say, well, that's exactly what Sam Harris says, except that, I was given this lecture before he wrote his book. But his book is better than my lecture, so read his book. When I talk about this, I'm talking about well-being is the language that Sam uses.
Oh,
I don't.
Yeah, well-being? What is this? I mean, this is when you have rampant philosophical ignorance, you don't even know when you're making these outlandish, huge metaphysical claims. Being. Well-being, not well-being. Okay, being is one of the most obscure, debated philosophical terms of all time, just like reason, just like nature. And Matt is going to propose what he thinks is a kind of a basic, pragmatic philosophy of well-being.
Sad.
I don't care whether or not somebody else considers that morality.
Okay, wait a minute, Matt. So, your subjective ethics that comes from an agent, your mind, that's pure random chance, that you said earlier has no basis to prove it's conscious. Consciousness has no real basis. But we're supposed to accept your random spewings, the farting out of your mouth that is meaningless chemical reactions are supposed to be now a well-being philosophy for universal ethics. I mean, this is just pure bullshit.
I would think at a minimum, would you and I agree that
that whole well-being thing, man, as a basis for a metaphysics, that's just a non-starter.
We're not basing
Thank you, Jordan. Correct. This is pure nothing. Now, finally, Jordan is getting at those presuppositions. Right? This is the strongest part of Jordan in this. His strongest part in the debate is right here.
Physics on it.
Sam is.
No, he's not.
Yes, he is, because he's out to maximize well-being.
Yes, Matt doesn't even know that the word being comes under the domain of metaphysics. I mean, this is how completely ignorant of this guy's going around lecturing, right? Imagining that he has some grasp of philosophy, and he doesn't even. And by the way, this is common of the atheists that come in the Discord to debate. They don't even know the branches of philosophy. They say stuff, don't even know that they're talking about stuff from philosophy. They just think it's self-evident. Just childishness, really.
Take it up with Sam.
Well, okay, sorry. Do you think I'm wrong about that claim? That's what I understood.
I don't think Sam's saying anything metaphysical about it. I think so. Here,
this is again, Matt. You don't think being and well-being is in the domain of metaphysics? If you had one philosophy class, which he hasn't had, obviously, you would know that the being is ontology, right? This comes under the domain of metaphysics.
The thing, we are physical beings.
Well, it's his fundamental claim.
Yes, thank you, Jordan. And correct, Matt, physics is a metaphysical claim, right? When you start talking about what is, remember Matt saying logic just is? Matt, that's a metaphysical claim, dummy.
It's sort of at the basis of his ethic. And so he says, well, we should work to maximize people's well-being, or at least to more. He does a bit more than that.
It's
He
not-
said,
So Jordan is correct here. This is the best part. Again, he's got Matt on the ropes, right? If he really wanted to, he could just like take the KO here.
we should
So
minimize their suffering.
He's not maximize, minimize in this sense of simple consequentialism. Let me do this.
Okay.
Matt is deflecting here. I mean, it's not hard to know what Sam Harris teaches about ethics. All Matt's trying to do is sell the program, to sell the story that they're not doing metaphysics. Okay? But anybody who has a basic grasp of metaphysics knows that all they're doing is metaphysics and lying because they're so ignorant, they don't even know what it is, telling you that they don't do metaphysics. Remember, like 5 minutes ago, Matt just said that.
We're physical beings in a physical universe, and the laws that dictate.
Matt, that's a metaphysical. Oh my gosh, dude, that's a metaphysical claim, you goofus. I mean, these people, he probably thinks metaphysics is when you go into Barnes and Noble and there's the metaphysics section and it says angels and witches. Like, that's probably what he thinks metaphysics is. Imagine being this ignorant.
How things work in the universe. They are the ultimate arbiters of what is or isn't in our best interest.
Dude, Matt, you are doing that. You are doing the very thing that you say is the problem of the religious people, and you're acting like you don't do it.
Whether we know it or not. So, for example, so far as I can tell,
Then why do you need free will?
I don't think.
Why do you?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Matt, free will, the agency that you said compatibilism earlier. Matt literally said, I hold to a form of compatibilism. That's a version of free will. Free will is in the domain of metaphysics, dude.
Believe
Free
in
will.
it then.
I-
Why do you attribute agency to things?
Yes,
if the laws
exactly.
of
Can
the
I
universe can
get to that one point?
Yes,
Well,
please,
yeah, but
please,
there was a
Matt, please
contradiction.
do.
That was confusing me.
Free will isn't relevant to this.
Here we go. Anything that is the challenge to my claims, the problem for my system, it's no longer relevant. No, it is relevant, dummy. He got you. Booyah, you got right there. That is the point where I think, I mean, Jordan really could have gone harder, right? But that's enough to really win the debate. Now, Jordan hasn't proven God's existence. He hasn't really proven anything except that Matt's incoherent and trying to make metaphysical claims. And Matt doesn't even know he's doing it because Matt is literally ignorant in the realm of philosophy.
It is if the laws of the universe are what are dictating what's good for us.
Correct.
No, because if you chop off my head, that is clearly not good for me.
Imagine being this dumb, like so ignorant of philosophy, so ignorant of the basics of what good in the history of philosophy is under the domain of ethics and aesthetics. Okay, what is the good? And metaphysics, right? Being. So Matt is so ignorant, and the people who listen to Matt are so ignorant of philosophy, they don't even know that to say things like all that exists is physics, or excuse me, is the physicalism, all that exists is matter, they don't even know that those are metaphysical claims. And they're also ethical value claims, right? Matt said the good for me. To appeal to the good is to appeal to something that is not identical to matter and to states of matter, right? Because having the head attached to the body and having the head removed from the body is a change in the molecular physical structure of what's happening here. But remember, there's not objective value between those things. There's only subjective value that's good for Matt. Now, if Matt, who is not a conscious being, has been snuffed out, that's no different than the state of being where Matt was not snuffed out. Remember, he likened the body dying to the TV turning off. And he said there's no real difference there. Now Matt says that it matters to me. It's not good for me to have my head removed. Big contradiction. Big, fat contradiction. Matt just BTFO'd himself.
And it doesn't matter whether it was an act of free will or if it was my lawnmower.
It's clearly not good for you because you think you're valuable and worth preserving.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you, Jordan. Correct. Matt doesn't realize he's appealing to objective notions of value judgments, things that are the good.
Yes.
Okay, that's the issue.
Correct.
Why do you think you're valuable and worth preserving?
Exactly.
Because I am the descendants of people who thought they were valuable.
What? Did Matt really just say that I'm valuable because I'm the descendant of people who saw themselves as valuable? Literally, like, I thought Jordan's arguments were bad in the first about the LSD stuff. That was one of the dumbest arguments I've ever. Imagine appealing to the fact that your like lineage because monkey value, right? Monkey have value. I have value because monkey value, right?
And worth preserving, and the ones who didn't think that
Pure bullshit. Matt, you just lost. Okay, Jordan was like pure weak sauce, dude, for like the first hour, dude. It was weak sauce, and it was Matt's arguments are so bad that Jordan's like little kind of pimp slap was enough to just end this debate.
Cells. But this is not a statement about.
I mean, the audience even laughing at this point because that was literally the stupidest appeal I've ever heard in a debate. No, I take that back. T-Dump, Mark Brahman. Nobody will ever top those two. And the Kurgan for dumbest arguments of all time. But this one is in the top 10. Remember this, right? Jordan asks a great question. Why do you think you have value? Literally, Matt's argument, Matt's reply is because I'm descended from beings. By the way, remember, he said that there's not a basis to believe in consciousness. Here he is appealing to conscious beings that he descended from. He's already contradicted himself like 10 times in this debate. And he literally says because they thought they had value. Dude, wow. This is what we get, right? When we have people who have no knowledge of philosophy at all, thinking they're making arguments, appealing to the dumbest shit imaginable to prove their argument. And who actually thought that was a good argument in the audience, right? Do the monkeys in the audience think that's a good argument?
This is not a statement about intrinsic value.
I don't know. Yes.
Well, what? Dude, he just asked, why do you think you have value? You said because monkey think it have value. And then you said, this is not a thing about intrinsic value. Dude, why is anybody listening to these people? I can't imagine believing that this is a good argument.
Yes, I think
No.
it is.
I don't even know, like, what fallacy do we class that under? This is such a dumb argument. Like, I'm having, like, my mind is in a twist. I'm mystified. I feel like I'm in Jordan's trip from earlier, trying to figure out what fallacy is this? I have value because I come from a line of monkey that think it have value. I don't even know what fallacy this is. Monkey fallacy. Is it just a version of a circular appeal? It's begging the question, first of all, because number one, dude, this is just so like I'm getting mad. I'm getting mad because sometimes arguments are so bad and so dumb they don't even fit into a classification, right? It's like this argument is almost like I'm happy. Why do you think that such and such? Because I'm happy. Like, what? It is a non sequitur. But I mean, remember from Matt's perspective, there's not conscious agents. There's no reason to believe in consciousness. There are agents. We shouldn't believe in anything non-empirical. I'm sorry, but his descendants are not empirical. His descendants as conscious agents are definitely not empirical. Consciousness isn't empirical. Value that his ancestors had is not empirical. I mean, on about 10 different levels and layers, dude, this is the dumbest argument in the top 10. It's not the dumbest argument ever. You'll never beat T-Dump and Mark Brahman and what's his face. But, bro, that was one for the records.
Okay, but I think it is.
Okay.
And then Matt turned around and said that this is not a question of intrinsic value.
The reason that we talk about this in terms of well-being is because irrespective of whether or not I care about well-being, there are facts about well-being.
Sure, let's hear them, man. Line those suckers up.
If you chop off my head, it's in contradiction to my well-being.
Oh my gosh. So my well-being is based on the fact that I come from monkey with well-being that think it have well-being. It's not good for me to have my head chopped off because it's contrary to my well-being, which is defined by what is good for my well-being. I mean, dude, I take that back. This is reality, bro. This is reality level argument.
I mean,
when you actually boil through Matt's smoke and mirror talking rhetoric, it's reality, bro.
I wasn't willing to grant that, actually.
Okay. Good,
I'm saying
thank you,
that's
Jordan.
a metaphysical presupposition. You're just saying I have to accept
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, Jordan. That's a metaphysical presupposition. I'm not going to grant it to you. So he has called out Matt's monkey fallacy.
that.
No, I'm not telling you at all what to accept.
Sure you are. You're saying
Here Matt is being dishonest, disingenuous. Matt, you are making an argument. And then turning around saying, I'm not making an argument. I'm not telling you what you should or should not accept. He asked you for an explanation of morals and ethics. You have said we ought to accept this secular ethical theory because you're afraid of it, Jordan, because you're going to lose your Christian presuppositions. There's nothing to fear. Let me sell you this. Now Matt is bullshitting and saying he's not selling you something. This is the game they play.
I'm trying to explain what my position is.
Okay.
Well, because you think it's true, dummy.
But you said that wouldn't be in accordance with your well-being.
Correct.
Okay, that's a metaphysical statement.
Yes, thank you. Finally. Jordan makes a heavy-hitting home run argument. It's the only one in the debate, by the way. So this is it. This is all there is.
Statement. It's not an obvious fact.
That
That's
chopping
not a
off somebody's
fact.
head is contrary to their well-being.
Matt is just appealing to the thing that's in question. Right? No justification. Matt doesn't understand what a justification is. And you go to the debate that I have with him and you can see that. He's lost. Right? When you ask for a justification, it just is. Right? Here, he's cornered. It just is. It's contrary to my well-being. Why? Because it's not good to have my head cut off. Why? Because it's contrary to my well-being. Why? Because it's not good. You just got, bro.
It depends on how you define well-being.
Sure.
Yeah, but it matters.
But if you define well-being...
Yeah, sure. Exactly.
Is this glass of water, we're no longer talking about the same thing.
Well, you can...
Jordan asks him how he defines well-being. Matt says, well, if you define well-being as a glass of water, we're not talking about the same thing. What?
Define well-being. That's fine. That's what I'm waiting for.
This is what I'm... Well,
you can't do it. You can't
Exactly. Matt is cornered.
define well-being. It's
well, then
very,
why
very
should I try? I
difficult.
certainly can't do it if you keep telling me I can't do it.
Okay.
No. There he goes, right? This anytime, especially the atheists, when they're cornered and they don't have a response, they do the thing where they call you out and say, well, you won't let me talk. You won't let me explain. No, we're not letting you bullshit. We're not letting you filibuster. We're not letting you go on the red herring. We're not letting you deflect. You can't leave this point because we got you, brah. You got, right? And now Matt's getting frustrated and he's saying, you won't let me talk.
Sorry, okay, I'll back off. Go ahead. I'm all ears.
Now, so I don't remember what Matt does because I haven't heard this in a year. I can bet you dollars to the donuts that Matt really likes. The many donuts, the dollars to the donuts that are in Matt's pocket that he asked me about. It wasn't really dollars. It was a bunch of donuts in that pocket, right? At this point in the debate, Matt will deflect, right? That's my guess. Let's see what he does.
The primary objection to mine and Sam's...
There we go. So now let's take it away from the thing that you asked me that I can't answer, and let's take it into something else. Look, this is the politician move, right? What does a politician do? Why were you at that whorehouse, politician? I think when we were talking about the economy, what we want to do is talk about jobs, right? It's like, bro, we're asking you about the whorehouse you were at. Exactly. The economy is the main problem.
That keeps coming back is, why should anybody care about well-being? And we both will acknowledge that this is, in fact, a subjective preference. There are people who are going to care about well-being. There are people who aren't. The second objection is
that that? It's a subjective preference.
Being is not clearly defined. Both of us have acknowledged this.
He admits it. He admits it's subjective. It's not clear.
To how to go about living a better life.
Typical atheist move. When cornered, you re-summarize, filibuster, what we've covered in the debate. We don't want your summary, dude. We don't need the transcript. We don't need you to rehearse like a frickin', village bard telling the tale. We're asking you a specific question. And Jordan asked a specific question. Don't give us your bard's tale summary, dude. We don't need that.
Just saying that
the bard's tale move, right? Remember this. This is what they do. When they're cornered, they step back. All right, look. Let's rehearse this whole debate. We started by doing, right? Ask yourself. He did this, right? Constantly when he's cornered, he wants to rehash the whole discussion. Dude, I don't want to rehash the discussion. It took 2 hours to get to this point. You answer this point.
However, we're going to define well-being, which is,
blah, blah.
I say you can start with a couple of foundations. Blah. You could start with death is preferable to life, but you don't get very far that way.
We're asking you why.
And stop suffering.
Well, no, I'm saying you could start with death is preferable to life, but you don't get very far that way because...
you do. You stop suffering. You just...
This is a good point by Jordan, right? That we can make this point against the atheists. I'm just kidding, the vegans, right? The vegans are always about stopping suffering. Okay, well, maybe we should just kill everyone, right? No, we don't believe that. No, we don't believe that. Well, now, wait a minute. Why not? If we want to reduce animal suffering, one easy way is to get rid of all animals. They will no longer suffer. Oh, no. Well, I mean, again, this shows the preference, the false assumption of quantity over quality. Maybe it's better to enact 1 minute of suffering to put the animal to sleep to reduce the possibility of a lifetime of animal suffering. You see, there is no way to know whether there's quality or quantity of suffering that should be reduced. Same way with utilitarianism. On what basis am I supposed to know that the quantity or the quality of the good is preferable? There is no. It's just arbitrary.
Just die.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Right, so you can start with the presupposition.
Except that when you're dead, you're not being, so there's no well-being.
Matt, you just contradicted yourself because you said that this is not an issue of intrinsic value. Now you're appealing to intrinsic value and metaphysical Matt just literally just appealed to being. And he says you can't do metaphysics. And here he is doing metaphysics. I mean, Matt is a car salesman. That's it. Matt's a car salesman. He talks about things a lot. And doesn't know the domains of the things that he's talking about. Right.
Well, that's...
Now the audience is clapping and they don't even notice that Matt just BTFO'd himself in the gibberish that he spilled in the last 20 minutes.
If
That's
it's
not necessarily the
if
case.
we're looking
because you
for the
could make
best
it-
things about our life, you
Yeah.
can't say death is better.
Yes, you can. That's the point, right? Because there is no better or worse. That's the question. What is the standard by which you know the good from the bad, the better from the best, the better from the worst, the preferable from the non-preferable? That's the question. Matt never answers it. He just filibusters, deflects, and circular appeal non sequitur to the grave. Right.
Yeah, you can.
Well,
People
I
do
know
all
that
the
you
time.
can say it.
People do all the time. They do. No, look.
They can
I'm not
express
being
their
flippant
preference,
about
but their
this.
preference can be wrong. How can it possibly?
Now Matt's appealing to right and wrong. Their preferences can be wrong. So Jordan's saying, well, some people commit suicide. Maybe that's the right way to go. And Matt says, well, some people can be wrong. Maybe they're wrong in what they're doing. Matt, that's the thing in question, dude.
Be better for your
What is the standard of wrong and better when you just admitted 5 minutes ago that it's subjective?
life if you're dead.
Matt, we know you think that it's better to be alive. Jordan is asking you why. And you're saying because it's better to be alive. This is the atheist, never-ending, just is the case appeal. It's the just is. The just is fallacy. That's what we're going to call it. The just is.
What if you, are a terminal burn victim with cancer?
So this is the point that I was getting to. I am perfectly fine with the idea that for certain instances, there may be occasions that death is preferable to an individual over life. But when we're speaking in broader terms, if we're talking about let's create the best society we can, let's create the best.
Matt, what is best? What is the standard of better and best? He says well-being. What is well-being? Well, it's not intrinsic value. What is it?
Quality of life we can for people.
It's subjective, but it's not intrinsic value.
Death is not that across the board. That doesn't
Why, Matt?
mean that there aren't individual exceptions. So the foundations that I started with, you could start with death is better.
So, again, I think we've had enough. You see that this is the best point of the debate. We've almost 4 hours, and we're going to do the super chats, but really, this is where Matt lost, and Matt doesn't even know he lost. That's the sad point here. And in our debate, it's an even higher level critique that he didn't even know what was going on. Like, no idea what justifying a claim is, no idea what David Hume taught, no idea that David Hume is refuting him. When I said, have you read David Hume, he thought I was appealing to an authority when I was referring to the arguments David Hume makes. All right, so, I mean, Matt is like in another world of, I don't know. But in the end, we will have to give the W here to Dr. Peterson. Now, did Dr. Peterson shine in this debate? No. This was a terrible first half when we had this rabbit trail of LSD junk that had nothing to do with anything remotely relating to an argument. Mere pieces of evidence and anecdotal things that don't relate to proving God. But remember, this is billed as a atheism conversation debate. And yes, eventually Jordan gets the W. But again, it was just kind of like a light pimp slap, and Matt kind of fell over. And Matt more so fell over, not so much from the pimp slap, but when he was trying to swing back, like his shoelaces got, tangled up and he fell over on his own, right? So it wasn't even so much Jordan's pimp slap when it could have been a KO. It was more so just kind of knocking Matt off of his balance and then tripping over his shoelaces. Right? That was it. So anyway, a lot of fun. Had a lot of fun with you guys. I'm starting to get a headache. We're up at the 4-hour mark here. So I hope you enjoyed this live stream. Be sure and hit a like. We got 600. We got over 600 tonight. We got 500 likes. Much appreciated. The links to the full debates are below, as well as my debate with Matt. All in good fun tonight. We take this seriously, but also in good fun. And let me read a couple of the super chats from 3 days ago when we had Richard on, and we had to do a premiere because I couldn't get Streamlabs to work. And so I couldn't answer the super chats directly. John Connor for $5. He says, "You should grow smart, but he may be the reptilian. Have you questioned him on the gender? Maybe I'm the gender reptoid. You're supposed to be the one to read the stories about the bears to go shopping. Get to the chopper." Yes, actually, Richard confided to me that he is one of the Cheta Ori 5 Sense Reality. John Connor again for $5. Have you read Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1? I just got it. Actually, I have 0 to 1 on my shelf, and I intend to probably read that in one of the Elite Books series installments. But thank you for that, John Connor. Where's John Connor? Ephraim, $20. How prevalent is Fabianism these current days? I don't know that most people know that they are involved in a philosophy of Fabian socialism. It's just rather that the Fabian socialists were very powerful in terms of inculcating most people into this kind of a worldview without even knowing it. So that's my response on that. Cara says $20. Here you go, boy. Take some of these stimulus, big ball of dead presidents, Cheddar, make it rain. Thank you, Kara. I will. And that will go directly into my Magic the Gathering crypto. I have a crypto coming out that's staked to Magic the Gathering cards. Neolin, $100. I found you from the debate with Molly that I watched live. I've gone from atheist and then to Protestantism, and of this morning I was chrismated into the Orthodox Church. Awesome, dude. Many, many years. Thank you so much. You didn't have to give me $100, bro. I'm happy that you are Orthodox, but I appreciate that fat gift. That's really, really awesome of you. God bless you. Pray for me. Thank you for everything that you do, and keep up the amazing work. God bless, and God bless you as well. Neolin. Sarah, $5. JBP worked for the UN. I'm aware of this. He was on a panel for sustainable development. He edited a document released in 2013 called New Global Partnership, Eradicate Poverty, Transform Economies Through Sustainable Development. Yes, I'm aware of that. A lot of academics, a lot of people on those boards. Let's pray for Jordan Peterson. We don't hate or dislike Jordan Peterson. We know that he has expressed interest in Orthodox Christianity, so we will continue to pray that he and everyone else converts to Orthodox Christianity. That's what we want to see. Little AIDS, boy, little A right there. $55, little AIDS. We know who that is. That's our boy Tristan, the second worst rapper in the world. He says, a little AIDS slays the fake bigot charades. He spits social justice, gender-neutral rap battle blades, and splash his non-binary gender fluids up on your face. He beats his wife, boyfriend on Mario Kart Nintendo Switch. That didn't rhyme, dude. You best recognize his pronouns or he make you his biche. Switch, biche. Okay. I mean, at least you had a couple rhymes. So you at least know that sometimes you have to rhyme it. But I don't know, little A's. Those bars are a little weak, bro. Those were like Kit Kat bars. That's all I'm gonna say about that. Eric for 20, but thank you for that $55. Eric, $25. He says, I would love to listen to your opinion on the Pajot brothers video, What is Symbolism? Where they discuss the idea that traditional biblical thinking and scientific thinking should be understood as different and not pitted against one another. Well, I have not seen the video, but I would agree that it is a different type of analysis. And at the beginning of this talk, we actually agreed with Jordan that, yes, in a way, in a sense, correct. You know, Moses isn't writing a science paper. But it doesn't therefore follow that Moses isn't describing an historical phenomenon or event, right? And again, I recommend Father Seraphim Rose's book on creation, but I have not seen that video from Jonathan Pajot, but I will probably watch it in the near future. And everybody be sure and watch the discussion that Pajot had with Matt Fradd. And by the way, we don't hate Matt Fradd. We don't hate any of the trads. we want them to become Orthodox. So we honestly and sincerely pray for the conversion of all the trads, of all the Roman Catholics, of the Jordan Peterson sphere. We pray that those people become Orthodox. That's what we want. We don't want to destroy them. We don't want to demolish them. We just want to see them become Orthodox. That's it. And we're very open and upfront about that. And I think people know that, we're sincere about that. John Hoffman, $20. Always great work. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, John Hoffman. Always great to see your perfect $20 super chats in the chat. Ian Garrett Sivo, $10. Paul Vanderklay reviewed this years ago. I think you mean this debate. And he has tried to use Peterson to bring atheists to Christianity. Paul Vanderklay. Is he some evangelical? I don't recall. I've heard this name, but I don't know who Paul Vanderklay is. And you said you should have a talk with him, and you can compare notes about JBP worldview. Maybe we'll see. I don't know Mr. Vanderklay, but maybe if he reaches out, something like that. Sure. Wendy, $6. Thank you. $5.99. By the way, we are working on a discussion with, and it's been requested for many, many years. I am talking to his scheduler person. It does look like it could go through. Chris Langan. Yes, we are going to try to have an interview with Chris Langan. Don't know exactly when yet, but it does sound like it's possible. So we're going to talk about his CTMU. We'll talk about what he thinks about tag. It's not going to be a debate. It's not going to be combative. Just going to be me asking questions. Going to be me, just kind of probing and seeing what he thinks about, his kind of philosophical case for God's existence, influences, right? His take on that kind of stuff. I'm curious. I don't know. I'm curious to know what he thinks about transcendental arguments. The CTMU it's an abstract math type of argument. It's not a transcendental argument, but I'm interested to know what Chris thinks. So definitely a genius guy. I don't think anybody doubts. We know that Chris Langan is a super duper smart man. So we'll see what he thinks about these different issues. But that's the next big interview, hopefully coming up soon. Wendy, she said, "Thank you. I found a reprieve from church world in your chat, and I listened to Jesus." Good. Maybe you had bad experiences at church. I don't know. But maybe try to find an Orthodox church. That's what I would say. Philo Bedeau. I always say that name wrong. But thank you, because we've seen Philo Bedeau's chats many times. Recommended reading for an in-depth treatment of the Orthodox conception of Hades or fate for non-believers. I think Metropolitan Hilarion Alfiev has a book on Christ's descent into Hades. So that would be the first one that comes to mind. Kane London, $20. By the way, for another perspective about something different, the St. Anthony's Monastery book on the soul after death, departure of the soul. So two different doctrines. So one, doctrine of Hades is not the same as departure of the soul, but those two books would fit the topics you're talking about. Kane London, $20. Have you read Golitsyn? His books would be great for the Globalist series. We don't put stock in Golitsyn. So read Mark Hackard's essay critiquing Golitsyn and critiquing Yuri Bezmenov. Okay, so go to Espionage History Archive and read the essay on Golitsyn, New Lies for Old, and read the essay on Yuri Bezmenov. That's the take that I have. I don't trust Soviet defectors who put out books at the behest of the CIA. Sorry. Doesn't mean I'm saying Soviets are good, right? Two bad guys. I'm not going to listen to the BS from two bad guys. That's what I'm saying. Tandem, $5. Wouldn't it be in the atheist's best interest to be immoral, so to speak. Exactly. I mean, again, maybe, but maybe not, because there is no clear idea as to what best interest or these value claims are. They're just arbitrary. And if anything that's just arbitrary like that can just equally not be the case, right? And that's why Hume says you can't get an ought from an is. The fact that something is the case can never tell you what ought to be the case. There is no ought. It's a very simple reply that Hume makes. If survival of the fittest is the case, Tandem says, then shouldn't humanity eliminate the weak? Well, yeah, I mean, this is the whole argument behind eugenics, right? But again, there isn't a justification for that, right? It just is the case. And that's the point, right? There's no justifications for anything. It's just shit happening, right? It's just one damn thing after another. And none of those things is better than any other things. And when you say, well, but I like some of them better than the other, it doesn't matter what you like. It's irrelevant. Your subjective appeals are not an argument. And they're not a basis for value judgments. They literally don't matter. And the same people who say this turn around and say that you aren't even a you. How is your subjective value judgment appeal going to matter when you turn around and say that you're not even a you? You don't matter because you're just matter. You matter as much as all other matter, which is to say you don't matter. You are no different than a pile of puke. You're just different formations of molecules. There's no better formation of molecule than another. Duh. There we go. All right. Thank you guys. Long stream. A lot of fun. Hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to hit like and share and subscribe. And since I went for 4 hours tonight, I'm getting a headache, so I probably won't do the hour 2 of the Gospel of John. So that will be tomorrow. So you can count on it tomorrow.